Joining me to discuss Curtis Yarvin's take on libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism is Ace Archist. One of the first things that stood out to me was his debate with Robin Hanson. I titled this "Finding the Best Chess Player" is how he summarizes his view of government. So when he was asked by an audience member, he was asked what his form of government would look like, considering he was very critical of Robin Hanson's futarchy. He says, "My alternative is very simple. I think that government should be run exactly the way companies are. I believe that it should be how you do select the person to run it should be selected by the financial beneficiaries of the sovereign. The sovereignty is always going to be extremely profitable. Public employees should have financial stake in how well California does, for example." Ace, what is your response to Yarvin summarizing his idea on what a good alternative to the current system is?
Well, so his system kind of it's this idea that you want to structure. So his view of a company is essentially a monarchy, right? You have a guy at the top, even though technically with CEOs you have a board at the top, but besides for that, you have a guy or a central figure at the top, and then through down you have workers. And his idea of structuring a government this way is essentially he thinks that a state will be run more efficiently in this monarchical structure, if you want to call it that, for this reason. A couple disagreements I have with this. One, when he's bringing an analogy to current corporations and current firms as they are today in today's society, it doesn't necessarily reflect how it would be without state power, right? So you can't just look at these companies and assume that they're like these free-floating abstractions or these islands disconnected from state power as it is currently. So when he's making an analogy to this, he's sort of ignoring the fact that these companies, a lot of these companies can grow to such a size in the first place because of the state power as it's structured. Whereas in a free market, we might see different types of firms rise up, and there might be a certain amount of de facto ceiling on the firms themselves, so that they can't grow to a certain size, or they might be structured in a different way. This is commonly called diseconomies of scale. Most people have heard of economies of scale. Diseconomies of scale is when a firm reaches a certain size or a certain level. The bureaucracy within the firm can cause information to be bogged down and choked in channels. So this means that they tend to misallocate their own resources. So if you want to structure a government like that, I think that would be it would be vulnerable to the exact same problems as a big corporation would without state benefits.
It's weird that he says, "I think that the government should be run exactly the way companies are," considering it's not like there's a small technical difference, they both are pyramid structure organizations. Right. The company can't, some companies, depending on whether or not we're under fascism or more of a free market regime, they can't expand unless they're able to meet consumer demand on a relatively large scale. And if they do wish to keep opening up branches and no one buys their stuff, well, they bear the cost. They don't have a monopoly on the money supply, which they could just continue to print and devalue the dollars in everyone else's pocket. So there's this self-correcting mechanism. This monarchy does not have this self-correcting mechanism, this constant feedback. So of course you can say, well, the monarch can very often take polls to see if people approve or disapprove of him. Well, there's a big difference between people saying they like something and people actually having to bear the cost of whether or not they like something. And when you're dealing with the scarce resources of the world, you want to make sure people have some skin in the game. So when he says the sovereignty is always going to be extremely profitable, public employees should have financial stake in how well California does, I don't see anything wrong with that. But the only reason that I would not support something like that is because human traffickers have a financial stake in how well their victims are doing. Jeffrey Epstein had financial stake, and Ghislaine Maxwell, and all slave owners have. You could say, well, the slave owner, it's cool because he uses his low time preference to make sure the slaves are better treated. It doesn't make sense to just murder them like they're in a gulag. But a system of slavery allows you to prolong the profitability of this individual, and you want to give him guaranteed food, guaranteed housing. So this is kind of an efficient way to engineer a hierarchical organization. None of that justifies it, nor does it say what you'd have in the absence. So yes, the slave could be productive, but what if he had more choices? What if people had more choices than one sovereign? If they had you could say you're the sovereign of your house, if you'd like to equivocate that. Well, shouldn't the sovereigns sort of be on their toes competing with each other to give us, the masses, a more profitable approach to achieving our ends? Anything else on this concept of we don't need democracy, we need to find the best chess player and give him the job of chess master?
Yeah, well, as you said very well there, the monarch still suffers from problems of information and economic calculation because he has no, he in some sense he's a monopoly because he's getting like coerced tribute, so you can't really compare like how well you're doing versus how well another like group is doing or how well another monarch's doing, unless they're like right next to each other, and then you can kind of like judge a little bit by like like people moving by their feet into a different monarchy. You can sort of judge it that way, but it's still not as good as the price as a price system would be if you could voluntarily choose what you were going to spend, what you were going to purchase, what service you were going to purchase from people. When you're a monarch, or any government official, really, as Hayek said, knowledge is local. So the people who are going to benefit the most from any type of knowledge are going to be the people who, one, or either are in that exact proximity or can gain implicit knowledge through the price system. And I think the monarch fails in both of those accounts.
Next claim is this repeated pattern of Yarvin referring to government as a tool. Calling it a tool is sort of implying neutrality. On this page, anything in italics is an actual quote from this discussion. The link to the video and the title of the video is at the bottom of the screen. So he first starts off, if you hand a butcher knife to a serial killer, obviously implying, what comes from that? Well, this is something terrible. What he fails to do is discriminate between something inherently bad, rape, slavery, genocide, kidnapping, versus a lack of utility, that something is temporarily bad, versus something that just needs improvement. Like, it wouldn't make sense to go up to the Wright brothers and say, you tried building the plane, it's inherently wrong, move on to do something else. Well, they just need to try a different way. He's calling government, where some people claim the right to literally own the bodies of others. They have a higher claim to your body than you do, without any contract existing, without getting your consent. And he's referring to this as a neutral tool. What are your thoughts on government is a tool, just like a hammer or a butcher knife, implying neutrality?
Yeah, this is, I often see this one a lot. So the state has never been defined as just some neutral tool, right? So what the government is, when libertarians or anarchists, when we're talking about the government, we're not merely talking about a governance structure in the same way that like a person would govern their property or something like that, right? So we need to make this distinction very clear. The state, as anarchists and libertarians criticize it, is an orientation. It's an orientation of these people in this institution in favor of legalized aggression, right? That is what the state is. It's a modality. It's not merely it's not merely like a car. It's a car being driven like on a suicide track towards a wall, right? That's what the state is. So you can't. So when we're talking about it, let's try to, because when we're defining something, we have to define things by what they're not, right? We have to define them by how they're different in some regard to make an actual distinction between them. So when we're talking about that, when we're talking about the state, we have to imagine, okay, take away the state's functions. Let's take away what makes the state unique, which is its legalized monopoly on aggression, its institutional legalized monopoly on aggression. If we take this away, what are we left with? Ultimately, what we'd be left with is just another firm on the market. right? It would not at that point be a state anymore, because if they didn't have a legal monopoly on aggression, they would not be legally justified in aggressing against other people who just wanted to like compete for security services or anything like that. They could not coercively collect taxation. So the state is a modality. It's a structure of it's a structure of a certain order. It's not it can't exist if you take away all of its components. It doesn't exist.
He goes on to say, this is sort of deconstructing the libertarian mindset. He says, the fact that is basically driving libertarians to become what they are. Let's imagine a world with no government and everyone is his own king. So right there, that is not exactly what drives me necessarily. It could just be our hatred for the cathedral, or it's funny, he debated Robin Hanson, and Robin Hanson's whole thing in his book, The Elephant in the Brain, is whatever people say their reasoning is basically, that's the first thing you could cross off the list, because what people do is their brain acts as a press secretary for what they really want to do. So when he says, when he's trying to get at the psychology of what makes what drives people to something, and he says, let's imagine a world with no government and everyone is his own king, considering that he does not differentiate between voluntary contract employer and involuntary monarch. This makes no sense at all if any libertarian has a job that he appreciates and thinks is morally legitimate, where he has to, follow the rules or regulations, I guess, since we're not differentiating between the state and society. Also, even if you are the boss, I remember saying, I don't want a stinking boss. So my friend and I started our own landscaping business. Well, it turns out that every customer was our boss. And there is no such thing as there's the people that have no boss and they have no constraints and they just sit back and collect money. That's not a thing. So I don't see anywhere where you're just your own king. Even the people that I know who had who are recovering from drug addictions or something like that, a lot of them recognize at some point in their life they have to basically hand over their entire schedule, when they wake up, what they do when they're up, when they go to bed, when things it's okay to read, places it's okay to go. This, what an ANCOM might see as like pure fascist totalitarianism, sometimes that's what people need. And if they have the choice to go to that sort of program to get their life in order from drugs or whatever, a lot of homelessness issues can be solved with something like that. There's nothing wrong with that. And that could be categorized as delegating kingship in such a way. So I don't even think he's getting at the root of the fact that is basically driving libertarians to become what they are. Is everyone is his own king. Do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see what he's getting at, in the sense that everyone is the libertarian claim is that everyone is their own sovereign, a moral sovereign. Sorry, everyone is their own moral sovereign, in the sense that you don't have a moral right to encroach upon another person's boundaries, justified boundaries, right? So I can kind of see where he's going with that, but I think you're correct that it misses the prime distinction here, which is that other people can delegate, at least within their consent, they can delegate certain like functions that you would not associate with a king, right? You would not necessarily associate the king with like working someone else's field, stuff like that.
If let's just say that was we took a poll and every libertarian was just got very excited at the fact that everyone's their own king. I don't see that as, if we think of king being the ultimate sovereign, the final decision maker of themselves and their body, I don't even see that as anything bad necessarily. Yeah. It's like saying, what's really driving this hatred of Jim Crow laws is they want blacks to be the king of themselves. The reason people are against abusing women is because they want women to be the queen of their own life. That's really what's driving it. Yeah, maybe. And even if that is, I don't see how that's anything terrible. So first of all, I don't agree with it. And second of all, let's say I'm wrong and he's right. Yeah. I don't see how everyone is his own king. I think that doesn't sound too terrible.
No. And I think going off of that, if we just said that, well, libertarian, or like, you're just saying that, oh, everyone has a right to life, and maybe Yarvin's critique, and if we're going to like stretch the analogy, would be saying, well, that's silly. People get murdered, right? It's like, well, yeah, they do get murdered, but the fact that people get murdered doesn't mean they don't have the right to life, right? That's just it's a non sequitur. It doesn't, it's not addressing what we're actually saying.
Of course, it doesn't embrace the human faculty of comparing things to ideals and then wanting to arrange your actions in such a way to achieve that ideal. Yarvin continues, that's an attractive vision because it's a hyper stimulus. Saying to an ordinary person, oh, everyone gets to be king, is like telling every guy he should have a supermodel wife. It continues on the next page, feeding this sense of hyper importance. To say there is no king over you is to say you're a king. Libertarians are chasing this dopamine rush where everyone is a king. That's a very childish desire, end quote. So the first thing I thought of is, of course, if everyone is their own king, it's not even anything bad. Second, there's always constraints. So it's not like you're a king in the sense of literally anything goes at any time for whatever reason, indefinitely in what amount. I mean, all you have to do is look at kings that are no longer kings, or Kaiser Wilhelm or something like that. He was once a king and then retired alone on like some island. Second, as far as calling it a childish desire, again, I could use the Jim Crow analogy of it's very childish just to tell some people, oh, you shouldn't have these laws, these are impositions. That maybe it stems from something childish. I'm sure any psychologist would say all of our views stem from childish desires. But what comes to mind when I think of childish desire is probably someone who believes in monarchy, that they have the right to tell everyone else what to do without any regard for other people's interests or other people's rights or what's wrong. And it's also someone who's very arrogant. Like if you talk to the kids who I used to babysit for my first job in the after school program at an elementary school, the kids would be like, what do when I'm older, I'm going to be a football player and a basketball player and a baseball player and an astronaut and the president, and I'm going to be a chef like Gordon Ramsay. Well, the only reason that the kids literally thought that is because they were so naive to how complex the world is, and being good at even one of those jobs takes a life of dedication. So you'd have to be very childish to think, there could be a king who could arrange how energy is distributed through the grid, and he's going to make everyone happy, and he's going to control the economy. Everyone's going to get fed. He's going to know how to get computers to everyone. He's going to know how to make microphones a certain way. He's going to make sure ceiling fans are constantly improving. There's just the right amount of investment, just the right amount of savings. The dollar won't get devalued over time because of the incentive of overprinting money to increase consumption now and decrease consumption in the future. So as far as being childish, okay, maybe it is, but it's not nearly as childish as everyone listen to me. What I say goes. I rule over you. Rules apply to me differently than to you. That's like every child who's just over entitled. Either way, it's a total straw man. Thoughts on ANCAPs or just kids?
Yeah, well, I think this is just, going back to what I said before, it's just like, this is in some sense a childish critique. So when he's saying that libertarians are childish, you could say that about anyone who holds any type of moral view, right? Anyone who holds any type of moral view, I guess you could say is childish, right? If you're against murder, rape, theft, you're against these things with the knowledge that they will still occur, right? So the fact that we understand that they still occur, but we're still against them, if that's childish, then you just have to write off every single moral proposition as childish, I guess, which Yarvin might do. I can't speak for him, but he might do that. So
well, say that you do write it off as childish.
Yeah.
You could say, well, these are people. He once compared, people talking about what should and shouldn't be. Well, these are just sort of people who have no control over government. They're like a guy on an island demanding that a prime rib, medium rare, be sent to him. They have no influence. Well, as opposed to him, who, what is he calling the shots? And by this time next week, the monarch will be ushered in, and we know for a fact this is coming, and he's very realistic in his desires. Like him trying to change public opinion. Well, that's just virtuous and it's very informative. But when other people try to do it just by explaining the rights that people have, well, that's a childish desire, like, Tom Woods in Castaway. Tom Hanks in Castaway, just demanding that a plane come and save him. So again, this constant double standards of very high standards for the libertarians and like no standards for the monarch.
Yeah. And, going back to his whole idea about monarchy, when he was talking about like how he thinks the government should be run like a business, I think the problem with that is that when he's talking about these firms don't exist on an island. They exist in a market with other firms, right? So you can't really, like, when you're trying to draw this distinction, you can't really, the analogy, in my opinion, just doesn't work, because he's trying to say, well, I want the government structured like a business, which is not structured like a government, right? It just kind of, it circles back in on itself and collapses.
So I had mentioned again on this slide, something that came to mind is that the consumer's king is Mises' common phrase. We always have constraints, even in a totally voluntary society such as free disassociation. This is commonly referred to as the constrained world view by Thomas Sowell in his book, A Conflict of Visions, which could be summarized as acceptance of the realities of the human condition. We are all limited by independent realities, which we ignore to our own detriment. So you could call it very childish to think that there's a king who just doesn't have any constraints, and what he says goes, and there's no negative effects, and he can just be the monarch over millions and millions of complete strangers. The concept of freedom to disassociate is a great check and balance that would not allow someone that even had these childish desires to exist. So if you take the supermodel wife example that he uses, there's part of libertarian theory that says you can have a supermodel wife, but the same exact theory also says the supermodel has the right to reject you and whoever else for whatever reason. So it's not childish to say you can get it if you want. By the way, the same thing exists for the other side of the equation. I think what's childish is saying that there's a monarchy and it's a one-way street. I would think that the adult would say, yes, there's your desires, and then there's other people's desires, and you have to bring these into harmony. So even the straw man, I don't think holds up. Any final words on childish hand caps?
Yeah. Well, I do want to address like the constrained view of humanity, because I think that's essential, right? You can't, like, I don't think you can even talk about governmental systems unless you take that into account realistically. I think talking about governmental systems without understanding the constraint of human beings, of human nature, that is childish, right? That is ultimately childish, because the whole point about the constrained view of human nature, of human beings anyway, is that our knowledge is limited, and our knowledge is extremely limited. And this factors into Mises's calculation problem, Hayek's use of knowledge in society. You can't imagine some Ubermensch or some king or something, or some central planner, right? Because that's ultimately what the monarchy is. Even if you accept, which I generally do, that a monarch has better incentives than a democratic system, the monarch still suffers from those economic calculation problems and those problems of knowledge. So the idea that a monarch could just exist and be able to calculate everyone's needs or like what they need in any given area at any given time, that's childish.
And you can still hold that view that monarchy is preferable. Most monarchies are preferable to most democracies, but you still have to recognize the importance of being able to, even superior to the monarchy, is being able to disassociate from a bad monarch who you don't find value in. Look, ideally, parents have the good incentive to have a low time preference with their children, to leave their estate to them, and then their kids leave their estate to their kids ad infinitum. But there's bad parents who beat their kids and don't have it. Cut one, because maybe they're evil, just like the monarch could be evil, or they're just so ignorant, just as the monarch can be ignorant. So for the same reason, it's not just inherently good that there's a monarch with a low time preference. He owns the people and the property. There's a lot of drug addicts who own their own property and to basically piss it into the wind. So
Yeah.
even though they are the essential owner, you need the freedom to disassociate with these bad actors, which monarchism leaves out, and that's a major shortcoming.
Incentives are not guarantees.
Of course. The point of divergence, I think, is important. Curtis Yarvin says, in referring to anarcho-capitalists and libertarians, he says that they're halfway out of the matrix. So it's good that they have a number of criticisms of the state and society. However, the shortcoming, he says, is they don't believe in anything productive or effective either, which I think is an unjustified criticism because it doesn't get to the distinguishing feature of what the ANCAP says. He simply says that no person has the right to rule or initiate aggression. To do so is claiming rulership or ownership over another person. And capitalism is just saying a social system based on the explicit recognition of private property and voluntary contracts between private property owners. So to say that they don't believe in anything productive either is sort of like saying the restaurant is useless because all it does is serve food and doesn't tell us the meaning of life. Yes. And the Apple Store just sells laptops, which is useless because without food, you starve to death. Well, the role of the Apple Store and the role of the libertarian idea and the role of the abolitionist and the role of the Substack writer is not to give you every single thing you need. It's to find a distinguishing feature in society, philosophy, and try to emphasize their specialization and their division of labor. So he talks of, well, his criticism could be categorized as an arbitrary overlap. It's like saying the problem with communists is all the black wearing and all the rioting and the bricks through windows. Yeah, they do that. And yeah, they just pretty much are all idiots. Virtually everyone I meet, from professors to the average student at Arizona State. But that's not the distinguishing features, abolition of private property. So if I'm criticizing that concept, that's where I'd focus, not on things that this is how they happen to be now. Well, in the 70s, Robert Nozick and Murray Rothbard were different types of ANCAPs. Republicans were different under George Bush than they were under Trump. That doesn't get to the bottom line of the idea. Look at Democrats from the 60s to today, the leftists. You would not recognize these people with their talking points, at least. So this, I think, saying that we're halfway out of the matrix, we don't believe in anything productive, is a very weak criticism. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I would just parrot what you said pretty much, because it's like saying we don't believe in anything productive. Well, I guess you'd really have to define, if he wants to justify that claim, I would really have to know what he means by productive exactly. Because it seems like most libertarians I know, most ANCAPs, most anarchists I know in general, very much so do support production, right? In fact, one of the main criticisms against the state is that it's a predator that preys on the productive class, right? So the idea that, well, we don't believe in anything productive, well, it ultimately depends on what he means by that. And going back to your point, when you're just criticizing one aspect of something that someone is not doing or that they're doing in a way you don't like, for example, what you said about, like, whenever we're specializing and we're focusing on one single aspect of something, we're always doing it at the expense of all other things we're not talking about at that one time, right? Like, you and I could be talking about something completely different right now, and people could criticize us, well, why aren't you talking about, X, Y, or Z instead? It's right. So anytime you dedicate yourself to any one thing, you're doing it at the expense at that time of all others. So yeah, I don't really see this even as a comprehensible critique.
Yeah, that was sort of Rothbard's main claim in Power and Market, the addition to Man, Economy, and State, where he says production precedes predation.
Yes.
So that's why we can call the state the parasite, rather than we only have the good things in life and all rights are actually positive rights, because without the state, nothing would exist. There has to be something to steal. And because that's the state's distinguishing feature, we know that, it's not the market that relies on the state. It's the state that is the parasite.
Yeah. Yes.
Yarvin said that he is not just a Luddite. He is a protectionist. Luddite in reference to people very hesitant to incoming technologies. It usually refers to people who want to outlaw innovation by force. being the people who were smashing factories and machineries to stop an increase in technological production. Protectionist generally meaning the state has a monopoly right to forcefully stop people from making trades with people outside of the state's geographical area, either completely through embargoes like Cuba or through high tariffs. On this claim alone, I'm not just a Luddite, I'm a protectionist. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I don't think we were talking about this before we started. It's very, because for anyone who doesn't know, Yarvin, he used to be a libertarian, and he thinks Mises is brilliant, and he is very familiar with the Austrian school. So when he says, I'm not just a Luddite, I'm a protectionist, and he still believes that Mises is brilliant, it really is this like unbridgeable impasse that I don't understand how he can even connect the dots here, to be quite honest with you. It's just like I'm just baffled, to be completely honest. It's one of those where it's like I can't square the circle.
So I just tried to summarize his arguments just because this was sort of a long interaction he had on a podcast. He says, libertarians see the government as bad in practice and therefore erroneously assume we shouldn't have a government at all. Libertarians see protectionism as it is today being a way to protect the inefficient, but it can be used for good. We're back to the state being a neutral tool. Yeah, so that is one criticism in and of itself, that protectionism can be used for good. The thing that stood out to me was notice the striving for the ideal while criticizing libertarians for idealism. So he didn't say there is protectionism, we have it, it exists, or we don't have it, we don't have Ludditism. So what are we going to do? Instead, we have Klaus Schwab. So there's nothing really. He gets to dream. He says, this is my ideal. I believe in Ludditism and protectionism and whatever. Why do we get all the criticism for idealism? It's a hell of a lot harder to enforce the exact kind of protectionists you want, considering there's so many products and such variety. I think it's less ideal and unrealistic to have universal free trade. You'd have trade between countries the way we have free trade between the states in America and the counties and the neighborhoods and everything else. And per protectionist. Yeah, so just on that, what would you say to the Yarvinian mindset of protectionism by the monarch for the greater good, using the low time preference to maximize the utility of his domain?
Yeah, well, I would just say it's like, if you restrict people from trading, if you restrict people from buying outside of like one geographic area, that's obviously going to hurt consumers, and it's going to hurt the production or the wealth, the overall wealth of the society, right? You're just adding costs ultimately, because when companies have that protection, they know that they don't have to fear like competition from outside market actors, right? So that they're able to raise prices more than they would be able to naturally. And this is ultimately going to make it so you're actually wasting capital and you're wasting resources, because people are being forced to pay more than they would be normal in a natural free market because of this constraint. So you're actually wasting things, right? It's like, imagine if some guy from some other country dropped a bunch of like cars off in your driveway for free. Would you think that, oh no, I'm poor now? Right? So you're increasing the cost within this geographic area in your little monarchy. You're increasing the actual waste that is being like generated through these artificially higher prices. Now, it's true that the protected class, the protected industries, they love it, right? They benefit, of course, but overall, it's not making your society any wealthier. It's just channeling the wealth into those protected industries. It's not actually, so you're just changing like how much goes where, as opposed to the overall wealth of the society.
Yeah, and again, it's not very clear why it would be countries that should have protectionism. Surely states should have it, and counties should have it, and families should have it. Also, that this is very it's a lot of power for something that is so complex, as opposed to like, look, even the explicit principle of it's wrong to say, even people who don't, consider themselves as total voluntarists, they'll say assault is bad. Well, there is a show called Who Violated the Nap. I don't know if you know this guy. His name's Chris, and he'll play a video, and the guest will say, this person or that person violated the nap. And it's sometimes difficult when the entire thing is on camera. It's really hard to pinpoint who is at fault here. So if that is difficult enough, imagine how difficult it would be, and what incentive would these protectionists have to spend time focusing on which industries should be protected. At what expense? What are we giving up for their protection? How much is the tariff going to be? Where is this money going to go? Is this going to empower the government that is so moral and not spending money on totally evil nonsense? In what amount? How long? Should it just be temporary? How much longer are we going to have this trade embargo with Cuba that Marco Rubio is so passionate about? That's really the only thing that really gets him passionate, is needing to embargo Cuba for another 50 years. Of course,
Right.
the amount of sanctions put on Russia for doing 1/50th of what the U.S. does. The protectionist has no incentive to really make sure that this can come out, because that he's providing a good service, because it would take so long for everyone to realize the negative effects of the protectionism, and it would be impossible to know what you could have had otherwise. So because of the complexity, and because no one has an incentive to really lock into, agricultural subsidies and other protected industries, they're just going to run amok. And the reality is, yes, it's immoral to stop people from trading, but even if we ignore the morality of it, that's going to be pretty complex. When it comes to being a Luddite,
Yeah.
what do you outlaw and when? And I don't mean to be,
Right.
I don't mean to
No.
be like, if we're ultra specific, touching someone's shoulder is a nap violation. I mean, even in general, we can at least say kicking someone 100 times is a nap violation, and saying hello to them is not. But, oh my God, did I misspell bicycle? Jesus. So when you look at something like technologies that should be outlawed, when the bicycle came around, would that have fallen under the hurting the horse and buggy industry? Or how about the automobile, or the phone,
Or the shovel.
or the cell phone?
Yeah.
The what?
The shovel.
Oh,
Just
yeah,
the shovel
the
itself.
shovel.
Imagine how many jobs were lost by the shovel.
The spoon manufacturers must have been up in arms.
Yeah.
What about computers? These things that at the time can seem so detrimental, we now see as like a total necessity. That totally ruined. Are there any scribes? Like, what percentage of people are scribes? I think like
Right.
people have assistants that take notes and stuff, so it still exists. But like the entire scribe industry could go out of business because people have the unfettered free market right
Right.
to purchase their own typing.
Yeah.
So I call this the protectionist slippery slope.
Yep.
Any thoughts on these?
Yeah, I actually, going back to what we were talking about earlier, how Yarvin criticized libertarians as having childish beliefs, and in some sense this is correct, because libertarians do have to ask people elementary questions a lot, and it's for reasons just like this, because going back to what you're saying, how do you know? Like how do you know which industry to institute protectionist policies for and which not to? What is your standard, right? How do you know? How do you intersubjectively compare? Even if we do like a utilitarian calculation, how do you know specifically that instituting this protectionist policy is going to grant you better results than instituting on this protectionist policy over here, right? So I guess maybe just a blanket protectionist policy, but then you could even go further. Why is it only countries? Why don't you do it in smaller and smaller geographies? Why don't you do it in towns, cities, municipalities? Right. So if that's like the thought process, then that should apply all the way down until you eventually reach protectionist policies in the form of one single monopoly, one single producer for each good or service within your geography. Also, yeah, going back down to what you were saying before, you like if you're a Luddite, when exactly do you like what is your line in the sand? What constitutes technology? Because here's the thing, right? As human beings, we are defined by our abilities to acquire tools and use tools, right? This is like one of the foundational definitions of what makes humans unique from other animals. Some other animals can use tools, but not to the extent humans can. So when you think about that, it's like every tool, every invention is a technology. It's a piece of, right? A shovel is a piece of capital.
Yeah.
It reduces the amount of labor necessary to acquire that end, right? So when you're doing that, you have to understand that this, in some sense, if you want to go through the protectionist mindset, is well, we don't want to lose our jobs to this other competitor or this other piece of technology or like invention. If we just get rid of all technology and we go back to living in like caves, right? Everyone is going to have a job. Everyone possible is going to have a job, and they will never be able to retire either, because they will never be able to they will never be able to build capital. They would never be able to generate anything that could allow them to retire in the first place, right? So I know, I'm sure Yarvin would not agree like with that conclusion. But that's the conclusion the logical conclusion of protectionism and being a Luddite. Ultimately, it's like, because ultimately, as you're saying, everything that has been invented has, in some sense, caused other jobs to not be as valuable or to be completely destroyed by these inventions, and then those people can use their labor in more needed spaces.
The answer to the question of, well, how do you decide or who decides? It's such a difficult issue that in any system you are relying on people to grasp concepts. So is one piece of sand a hill of sand? No. Well, do we have to get to 1 trillion pieces? Couldn't 500 billion also count? Well, yes. So you sort of have not exactly a line in the sand, like a precise, this is good, this is aggression, this is not aggression.
Mm-hmm.
Hitting someone with this amount of power moves it from a pat on the back to assault. You don't have that, but instead, what the libertarian correct response would be is, this is a concept that is inherently bad. The best way to achieve a society in which there is the least amount of aggression is to have voluntarily funded competing court agencies that could give us the answer to what counts as aggression and what does not.
Yes.
Just like if you're trying to achieve justice. We want to achieve justice. Well, that's extremely difficult. Giving the state a monopoly is probably the last thing you would want to do. So of course we've discussed the freedom of exchange, what Nozick called capitalist acts between consenting adults. He's wrong there. But just on a utilitarian basis, this gives too much discretion to people who have no incentive to provide a good product or to provide a good service, because they can always say, look at this industry I saved. It's going to be impossible. I mean, besides the psychics who were like, well, this could have been created. There's no way to account for that. You're unable to account for the variety and complexity. How many goods, in what amount, at what time, for what people? Should there ever be exceptions? It's hard enough to do that with assault. So don't tell me you're doing it with billions of people and tens of billions of products. And there's too much room for a small error creating a big cost. It is it is literally like saying, so he doesn't get to say, I believe in protectionism because I believe in protecting people. It is the equivalent of saying, I think marriages and friendships should be good. We don't want bad ones. What we want are good ones. So therefore, the state monarch should outlaw bad marriages and bad friendships. Now, I guess I would want a world in which those didn't exist. But in order to achieve that end, I'd have to give the state pretty much unlimited power to have a camera and microphone in every house that they're observing, as if the NSA isn't already, and giving them the ability to determine what counts and what doesn't. We also shouldn't have bad art. Why have bad art when you could have good? We shouldn't have bad jobs. We should have good ones. So why not let the state just outlaw them? And we shouldn't have bad products and bad services and bad parenting. And government should pursue the greater good. There's just too much discretion for too few people that don't have the information, not to mention who does it attract? The psychopaths, friends of Jeffrey Epstein from all over. So my general claim is that it's too vague, gives too much leeway to tyrants, and will lead to overall disutility. Final thoughts on Ludditism and protectionism.
No, I think you summarized it beautifully. And you know what you said before about the about monarchy and governments in general is that as opposed to like a firm on a market, generally speaking, is that when a centralized structure makes a bad decision, it reverberates all the way through that centralized structure. So if you're in a society that's heavily centralized, this central planner makes a mistake, it's going to be felt by every person. Right. So our claim, the libertarian claim, is not that decentralized people and individuals are always going to make good, rational actions. It's the claim that when they do make bad actions or bad decisions or costly decisions, it's not going to mostly in general terms, it's not going to extend to other decentralized actors. Sometimes it does, but generally it doesn't. And that's why it's superior to centralization, which spreads the cost of bad decisions all the way down through everyone.
Exactly. And so even if you see the monarch doing something ridiculous because he's either evil or ignorant or lazy, you don't get to use your own low time preference for your own future. It's always his low time preference at the expense of everyone else's. On Tucker Carlson today, which, by the way, I get that we're spending this time criticizing him. We do it because he's like one of the most brilliant people probably ever.
Very intelligent. Yeah. Extremely intelligent.
So that's why it's going to be worth going through all this stuff. His appearance on Tucker Carlson today, I think I've watched 3 times. This I recommend more than anything else. Actually, my own interview with him was really good. The Tucker Carlson is second. He says, here is the last monarch in America, Franklin Roosevelt. So he says we have the same title, but different power level. Would you mind reading this Yarvin quote?
Oh, yeah, sure. So he goes on to say, could we make the White House 10 times as powerful over the executive branch? Very easily. Could we imagine at that point we're reaching the powers of, say, LBJ? Could we make the White House 100 times as powerful over the executive branch? At this point, we're up to the powers of FDR. So people think when they vote for Donald Trump, they're voting for the same job that FDR had. They're actually voting for like 0.01% of that job, which is a really serious misinterpretation of reality.
I think that's such a great contribution intellectually, because we forget that, that is the same title that Franklin Roosevelt had, but Trump and Biden and Roosevelt are not have an equal amount of influence. I would be shocked if Biden even writes his own speeches, even when he calls on people. He said on 2 occasions, hold on here, I got a list of who to call on. Every single thing that guy does is planned. He doesn't run his own Twitter account. No. So I mean, we go from like a very powerful executive to Biden, and it's not the same. So he says this is important because people are getting gaslit. It's, the equivalent of saying, Ace, clean my house, and then you will determine the events in Spain. It's like, so obviously I'm using you to get what I want out of you and lying to you about a positive effect. So I was glad that he brought this up. The main thing is he advocates monarchy. The closest thing we've had recently to a monarch is Franklin Roosevelt. Ace, thoughts on how well the last monarch was for America?
Yeah, it wasn't too great, shocking. But I guess, we always have to do these comparative advantages. But even when we compare, even when we're looking through libertarian terms, FDR is usually considered one of the worst presidents. When you look at like what he did, World War II, things like that. And I know that's a hot topic because a lot of people think, well, that was the justified war. I'm not going to drag us down and get into that right now. But then you have to think about like everything that FDR did. The New Deal set the groundwork for fascism in America, right? That's what the New Deal did. But all these things of like corporate interests being able to colluding with the state comes from the New Deal directly. Like that is the main. So when people talk about, how bad fascism is in America, you can thank FDR for it because he really, really jump started it. Even more so than I would even say Wilson, which in my opinion was probably the worst president of the United States. But yeah, FDR was not great whatsoever.
Yeah. So I should have made my list clear. So when it comes to monetary policy, the Gold Confiscation
Yes, gold
Act
confiscation.
that
Yep.
was just pure evil. I mean, but by every metric, the state monopolizing something this valuable puts a lot of power in the hands of the few. And did it end the Depression like he thought it would? Well, he of course ran on Herbert Hoover, bringing us into socialism, and we need to you know what, it's funny, Yarvin constantly plugs The Machiavellians by James Burnham, and the opening paragraph in The Machiavellians is, here's the democratic platform, national platform in 1932, and it's a bunch of ways of why we need to shrink government. It's just a list of that. That's The Machiavellians by James Burnham. What was it, like 1940 or something?
Yeah, 1941, I think. Yeah.
So you can see that the last monarch was a total liar. And, well, hey, you want to make an omelet, you got to crack a few eggs. The Depression lasted far longer than previous downfalls, such as the panic of or recession of
Right.
1920 under Warren G. Harding, who was actually a do-nothing president. That's why we don't hear about him, because he was much closer to do nothing than Hoover, who tripled spending, increased taxes, it used protectionism. So just more on FDR, Japanese, German, and Italian internment.
Yep.
So like our biggest criticism of Australia, he of course did that on a large scale, hundreds of thousands of people unilaterally engaged in large-scale slavery under the guise of conscription, the worst form of probably occupation that you could be. I can imagine getting my fingers, arms, legs blown off, getting an eye shot out, and thinking, God, as bad as forced cotton picking was, I think it might have been better. As far as the Second World War, of course, the war declared by Britain on Germany for Polish independence ended with giving Poland to Stalin after 60 million deaths, giving us communism in China, the spread to communism in Korea, and the Vietnam War. Not necessarily good things. The mass murder in Tokyo, Operation Meeting House, 100,000 people in one night, continues the myth that we need the state, and World War II was this, inherently good war, just like anything else. So his most recent example of a monarch is the second worst president I think that America has ever had, and he's given Wilson a run for his money. Final thoughts on FDR being the last monarch and Monarch being the best form of government.
Right. I'm sure, like, if Yarvin was listening to this, he would consider this like cherry picking, but I think I don't think it's cherry picking. If like this is his example, it's very appropriate to okay, look at what happened. Now, this doesn't necessarily imply that every monarch that Yarvin would support would be like FDR, but the fact that he would use FDR kind of as the example here is questionable about the claims of monarchy in general, right? Like, if you have a man who essentially committed so much mass murder, theft on a global scale, instituted like a fascist policies in the U.S., and of course slavery through conscription, it's like, this isn't looking too great for monarchy, in my opinion, if this is his close to his ideal.
He then gets into his concept of the cathedral on Tucker Carlson. Would you mind? My voice is getting killed on this.
Oh, sure.
Would you mind going?
Sure. He says, he quotes, the deep state, or the swamp, or the cathedral, or whatever you want to call it, this world of permanent influential people inside and outside of government. And it's very important that many of these power centers are outside government proper. I've noticed that, and you might have noticed that. They're beyond the control of the population. That makes them completely unaccountable. Sovereign, beyond the reach of any accountability whatsoever. So he's essentially saying that, these power structures exist and essentially prop up the state outside of it even.
And it's really important because he brings the intellectual, the intellectual grasp behind a concept that was like 5 years ago, you're a crazy conspiracy theorist if you believe in the deep state. As if there aren't what percentage of government employees changed from Trump to Biden or Obama to, he has a funny joke about how at the State Department it's really inconvenient when one president when the parties and the presidents change. You have to get a whole new picture. You have to reframe it. You have to put it up. What if you had just dusted the picture of the last president? Other than that, everything stays the same. So it is a great contribution that he brings this people inside and outside of government. That's something that I'm very glad. Of course, Milton Friedman and Murray Rothbard always said that it's the intellectuals and big business that are holding up the state, in which, contrary to what Ayn Rand said, big business, the America's most persecuted minority, Rothbard and Anthony Sutton, who worked at the Hoover Institute, were constantly saying, look at how big business is pushing for big regulation. G. Edward Griffin, the voluntarist, says, look at what these private businesses did at J.P. Morgan using the state and the Federal Reserve. So, but before getting on to beyond the control, you have the media, Harvard, all these organizations. Thoughts on the cathedral and the deep state?
Well, I think this is probably some of Yarvin's best work. I'm very grateful for this work because I think it's very true, right? So the idea of these power structures that complement the state, that are there, that are supportive of the state, and of course you have the deep state that's inside the state, that doesn't change. But you also have power structures outside the state that complement it and are there to prop it up in some sense, like a foundation of a house. That makes sense to me. And talking about big business, there is obviously the symbiotic relationship between businesses and government, because big businesses want to grow and they want the government to crush their competition. And these big businesses are only in some sense big because the state crushes their competition, allowing them to absorb market share and things like that when they normally wouldn't be able to. And obviously, the academic class and the media, they are there to essentially support the regime. Not all, there's some exceptions here and there, especially with alternative media nowadays. But historically, this has obviously been true, right? This conservative delusion about, the media being there for like the free press to hold the state accountable is insane. It's like, trusting the state to enforce the Constitution. It's like, no, that's the incentives just don't align there. They have no incentive to actually, expose the truth of the people who give them power in some sense, because it's very much a symbiotic relationship.
And in the same way, you get pretty much most rabbis on the same page about everything. You get them synoptic is by getting them reliant, either financially or emotionally, on one sort of center. So it's not like there's one imam who controls all the mosques.
Correct.
From Scottsdale, Arizona to Saudi Arabia to Australia. What you have is this lie, when in our case it's statism or even Keynesian economics. I guess even if you didn't have a state, you'd still have this terrible lie of spending is production and not the other way around. Yeah. So you could still have this stuff, but this concept of throne and altar, as Patrick Newman says, you have the king who would want to employ the priest to tell people, the reason you have an obligation to obey this guy, the king, is because it was divined by God. You got to make those people reliant. The same reason states constantly make you dependent on intellectuals. In fact, I'm just remembering Milton Friedman said that, if it was just education that the state wanted you to have, they would have school stamps, sort of like food stamps. You can go to school wherever you want. We'll give you the stamps because we just care. It's important that they monopolize compulsory education because that's a much different outcome. People can see this when it's like, well, the donor class backed Pete Buttigieg and they backed Jeb Bush. And it's not like he's a robot that they're controlling. What they do is they make the politicians reliant on them. And he who, pays the piper calls the tune. Well, obviously, it's the same thing with the state. What are your thoughts on they're beyond the control of the population, completely unaccountable, sovereign beyond the reach of any accountability whatsoever?
Yeah, so I think I'm not sure I would fully go that they're completely unaccountable. I think they are in the sense that while they're connected, so while they're in this symbiosis with the state, they're at their most powerful, right? Because of this, the state's granting them privilege, and the big businesses and the media, the academic class, they're granting the state privileges, right? So it's this symbiotic relationship. And when this is going on, it's very hard to hold any of them accountable. And also, well, to be clear, you can't really hold the government accountable outside of like counter economic action and certain local politic issues. Federal Trying to hold the federal government accountable is nearly impossible. So I would grant that at this moment in time anyway. But I don't think it's they're unaccountable in the sense that over the long span of time they're unaccountable. Because certainly you do see what would be like, these institutions, some of them do eventually fail, right? And it's true that new institutions do come to take their place. But I do think that if you had a decentralized market, I do think their ability to grasp power would be diminished greatly. And I don't think they'd be able to cement themselves in the positions that they're cemented in currently in society.
So if you are upset that there are people without any accountability beyond control of the population, you'd want to make sure that there was a free market that people could disassociate with.
Yes.
Employees can not work there if they don't want to, and you want the employees to have the ability to do so. So you'd want a free market where there were more options and more businesses to choose from.
Yeah.
You'd want consumers to have more options to stop consuming from whichever organization was unaccountably controlling society. And also, I'm actually not sure. So I hope this isn't a straw man, but isn't his whole thing that the monarch being unaccountable is a good thing because you don't want accountability from the masses who are generally
Yes.
uninformed and uncaring? So he's
Yes.
saying it's really bad that, the cathedral is like totally unaccountable. Also, we need a monarch who doesn't have to answer to idiots. I can see pros and cons to both sides. I'm actually just thinking out loud with that one. How do you think they would respond to, or that he would respond to that?
Well, I think his whole structure. So I think he's just being descriptive here. I'm not sure he's necessarily prescribing that it's necessarily bad. I think he's thinking more of this as an engineering thing, where it's like, look, this is just the way it is. This is just how it works. So I'm not even sure when he says they're completely unaccountable. I don't think he's necessarily saying that's bad. He's just saying, look, this is how it works. This is how bureaucracy works. This is how oligarchy works.
Got it. He continues his concept of a press-controlled state, which I believe is in his book, A Letter to Open-Minded Progressives. But this was, again, on his discussion with Tucker Carlson. He said, the most powerful organ of government in the government today is not even in the government. I would say it's probably the New York Times. It's at least a reasonable thought. And the interesting question is, okay, is the New York Times a democracy? How is the New York Times governed? And then you think about it and you're like, oh yeah, I see. It's a fifth generation hereditary absolute monarchy. Oh man. And try as you may, you cannot eliminate this form of government. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Well, I have a lot. I have some problems with this statement, surprisingly. So first off, I would say he's saying that the New York Times is the essentially, because there is something to this, right? There's absolutely, I want to give credit where it's due. There's absolutely something to this where in a democratic government, in a democratic state, you could very easily make the case that the media is in some sense the prime mover of political interest and political government in itself, right? Because the media determines what the topics are. They determine what are the appropriate ways you can view this topic, and then people have this illusion of choice when they go and when they actually vote. Now, in terms of it being a monarchy, I would just say that I again would want to emphasize that you have to be very careful and not to equivocate. So when he's talking about monarchy, there's a difference between a governance structure, in like an internal governance structure, and a government, right? So an internal governance structure might be like, I own a piece of property or I own a business, and I have the final say in what goes on with the business, right? You could make the claim that maybe this is monarchical in the sense that this is a governance structure, this is an internal governance structure, but the difference between that and a monarchy is that a monarchy extends beyond its own justified boundaries into other boundaries and claims to own the properties of other people, and the people, the actual persons of other people too. So I think it's very important we make sure not to equivocate these two things. And sometimes Yarvin threads the needle and gets very close, I think. As far as the New York Times is, essentially the main institution of the government. Um, so that may be true, but I think it's certainly less true today than it is in any other time in history, right? If you look at the media, the power of the media and the trust in the media, it's gone drastically down. So this is why I'm hopeful, and I think Yarvin has a much more pessimistic view, and which you would say is a realist view. Um, I do think technology is ultimately going to lead to more decentralization. 50, 60 years ago, there were three channels. Right? Where it's like that, and that's how you consumed your news. That's how you got your news. That's how you got a lot of your opinions about things. A lot of the ways you think about things, who to vote for, who was good, who was bad, came from those three channels. Now, of course, those channels still exist, but because there's so much competition, even if that you want to say that a lot of this is the competition is controlled, which that's certainly true, there's still more competition, and there are alternate media sites. Your alternate media, Keith, what we're doing right now is is something that would never happen on one of the big three channels, right? So Yarvin is alternate media, his Substack. So you have all these things where like 50, 60 years ago, these people would never have been heard from. Like, even if you want to say that, yeah, censorship is bad right now, and I agree it is, the fact is it's better now than it was 50, 60 years ago. So I think if he's trying to tell me that the press is controlling the state, and I'll certainly buy that, I would say that the power is certainly weakening in a trajectory. If we look at a long form trajectory, the power of the state, or the power of the press over the people, I should say, sorry, is going down.
And his refusal to, as someone who's read Hoppe, Democracy, the God That Failed, especially the last 4 chapters of that book, are just so explicitly advocating for a system of anarchism that if you've read that, you have to know the difference between hereditary absolute monarchy in North Korea and hereditary monarchy in the form of, the Waltons at Walmart. I mean, you can always say, well, it's impossible to compare those in, how they operate, but he's just sort of categorizing them in a similarity that they happen to have. He's not differentiating voluntary groups with involuntary organizations. That is just shocking that he doesn't care to make that distinction. And if, this is just a monarchy, well, then he should just be an ANCAP, because you would have private courts and private police that would be monarchies, because they'd have CEOs, and monarchies are really good. And there's no difference between a state monarchy and a voluntary monarchy. So I don't see his point of distinction here. Yeah. So when he says, try as you may, you cannot eliminate this form of government. Please call me out if I am strawmanning here, but when I think, I go, okay, well, what is he talking about? We have 2 things. We have monarchy, we have state monarchy, we have monarchy in the private sector. Of course, you have the fascist monarchy in mixed economies, which probably is closer to places like America. And try as you may, you cannot eliminate this form of government. Is that falsifiable by me finding empires that have been killed, or forms of governments that have been killed, considering if I just look at things like in my generation alone, it's like Blockbuster, Sears, Circuit City, MySpace, and AOL are like these big, gigantic companies that everyone goes to, everyone knows about them, and now they don't exist. So these are governments, these are monarchies, private monarchies, totally unaccountable, that somehow have gone away, even though they're monarchies that you can't kill. Let's even look at government monarchies. Well, you have the Ottoman Empire, which was killed. You have the British Empire, which in 1913 ruled over 412 million people, also known as 24% of planet Earth, 13.7 million square miles. You have the Mongol Empire at its height in the 14th century, people like Genghis Khan. So I don't see how he can say that you can't kill these monarchies when there's Wikipedia lists of defunct retailers, so those would be private monarchies, lists of newspapers, so if we're just talking about the media and the press-controlled state, there are thousands of newspapers that are no longer in business that were monarchies, lists of empires in the state sector and monarchies that have that no longer exist, that has to conflict with the idea that try as you may cannot eliminate this form of government. By any stretch of what he means by monarchy, in every case, there have been like thousands that have been eliminated. Am I wrong on this? Am I totally missing his point?
I think what he would say is that he's talking about the form as opposed to the content. So I think what he would say is he would say that, yeah, you might see these individual monarchies fail, but another monarchy just takes its place, right? Kind of like MySpace into Facebook, something like that. So I would actually disagree with that ultimately, because I do think you can, and I think we're going to get to this later when we talk about his whole idea about the conservation of power in society. But I do think you can actually divide these power structures.
Okay. So yeah, here are just a screenshot of all the different empires.
Yeah.
By like any reasonable metric, these count as what's his word? Cannot eliminate. These are empires that were eliminated. Thomas Sowell. So now we're back to the private sector. He was saying that, well, because of the Constitution, you can't explicitly regulate the New York Times. They're unaccountable. Well, Thomas Sowell in his book, Basic Economics, is discussing the rise and fall of business in the income mobility section. He says, ordinarily, we tend to think of businesses as simply money-making enterprises, but that can be very misleading in at least two ways. First of all, about 1/3 of all new businesses fail to survive for 2 years, and more than half fail to survive for 4 years. So obviously, many businesses are losing money. Even among the truly rich, there is turnover. Okay, so here we have the organization failing. But then you could say, well, yeah, technically empires and companies and those things exist, but you still have the people in power. So it just goes from like MySpace. Yeah, that goes, but then you have Facebook. Even the individuals. So under no definition of cannot eliminate, this counts as being eliminated. Even among the truly rich, there is turnover. When Forbes magazine ran its first list of the 400 richest Americans in 1982, that list included 14 Rockefellers, 28 DuPonts, and 11 Hunts. 20 years later, the list included 3 Rockefellers, 1 Hunt, and no DuPonts. Just over 1/5 of the people on the 1982 Forbes list of the wealthiest Americans inherited their wealth. By 2006, however, only 2% of the people on that list inherited their wealth. So nice shot at commies for believing in intergenerational wealth and one person getting wealthy and then his heirs being wealthy forever and everyone else being impoverished. But it also hits at this fact that, well, they're unaccountable. Nothing you can do unless we issue a monarchy, then our hands are tied to the cathedral. I think he is just explicitly wrong on this. Anything else you think I might be missing?
No, I think you're dead on.
All right. The italics is a quote again on Tucker. He's talking about the Gilded Age. Could you read that quote, please?
Yeah, sure. He goes on to say, if you see a description of the Gilded Age, go to an old American city. See all those brick buildings and that beautiful old stuff? All like DC. All that is built in what we call the Gilded Age, which is a period when America was governed very much the way China is now. It was very corrupt. Politics was an incredibly sordid, screwed up business. Shit got done.
So that, I believe, is his ultimate point. He goes, look, there's all these systems and you can have these beliefs and this ideology. I want stuff to get done. When I see a place that was like empty and then it has these nice buildings, whatever got the buildings there, whatever time preference and set of incentives that got these buildings built, that's the place I want to live in. This I mainly took out because I think it just gets to the idea of I really want to be favorable to him as much as possible,
Absolutely.
not because he's dying for my approval, but so I could understand one of the most brilliant people who I've ever had the pleasure of speaking with. Any thoughts on getting into how this shit got done mindset when looking at his criticisms of libertarianism overall?
Well, I do want to address this for one thing, because I did want to actually jump in and talk about like how he's saying how it was corrupt, the politics was corrupt, and shit got done. Okay, well, the first thing I'd want to point out here is that the correlation, like all I see is, without further evidence to support his point, I just see this as a correlation causation fallacy, right? Like even if you correlate that the Gilded Age had very corrupt politics in the time. I mean, politics are corrupt right now too. But his point would be that there'd be more like backhanded, dirty, like thuggish politics, which I would still say happens right now. But beyond that, if we just grant him the point for a second, I would still see this as a correlation causation fallacy, because just because that's correlated with that time period doesn't imply that the politics is what caused the innovation or the building of these landmarks that you would see today, or any of the things that we would associate with the Gilded Age, like the technological advancement.
Yeah, I mean, I think whatever sort of system, whether it's collaborative, private, public, that he's saying the Gilded Age was, but because he's not saying it was communism under a monarch or it was free marketism, whereas Robert Higgs makes the point in his book Transformation of the American Economy, he intentionally uses 1865 to 1913, where there was this general, of course, there was a Spanish-American War, but there was not this war economy like we have today or something like that. Higgs uses that period because he goes, all right, so we've been devastated with the Civil War, 600,000 deaths. And then the First World War, obviously another 117,000, Americans dead. That was a wartime economy. Was there any growth in this age? And Higgs said, yeah, this Gilded Age, we had much more of a free market than you otherwise would have had if you had this war economy. The bigger the war economy gets, well, everyone else wants a piece of that honeypot. So the teachers and the agriculture and the farmers and every other industry doesn't just stay silent. They see, hey, this government's growing, I got to get a slice of that. And then everyone gains at the expense of everyone else. Of course, if we're looking for the determining factors of what makes countries rich, certainly you could, by his definition, North Korea has to be a hereditary monarchy, from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. If you look at that versus South Korea, where is the shit got done? Right. East Germany versus West Germany, where is more shit getting done? Botswana versus Zimbabwe. Ghana versus Ivory Coast when they received independence from Britain, where was the shit getting done? East Germany and West Germany is probably the best example. Of course, finally, they've started addressing this. I don't know if you've heard, but they said, well, that's not a comparison. A good comparison is Sweden versus America. Of course, all you have to do is look at Swedes who are in America and see that more of that they're wealthier than they are in Sweden. Right. So that's a better comparison. But as far as East Germany not having a lot of natural resources is what they say, well, Hong Kong barely has any, but because of free trade policies and more private property and contracts, they are much more of a getting shit done. Even you look at India since 1991, their reforms, or China since 1979. They were certainly the monarchy under Mao while they were starving, but the more private property and the more free exchange they had, well, they were wealthier. So, but we'll get into the China stuff later. Final thoughts on shit getting done in the Gilded Age.
Well, I think, this goes back to the whole point with Rothbard, was just like, production precedes predation. So, like, whenever people want to try to make this about, oh, well, look, the state was doing this during this time period and X growth happened, right? It just doesn't, those things don't imply one another necessarily. So I would make the claim that everything you see, all technological advancement, comes from entrepreneurs in the market producing value for other people, and that value gets distributed through society, and it gets built up and generated in the form of more technology, capital, just institutions themselves. So whenever people see that, I think it's a much safer assumption to assume that this was the act of market transactions rather than any type of government protection or interference.
Yeah, and we get a lot of people escaping much more monarchical Cuba, escaping to America rather than people escaping DeSantis to be under the kind rule of, I forget who took over for Castro, whoever did. But the reason I use those sorts of comparisons, also Chile and Venezuela, similar populations in similar geographical areas, those are just better comparisons. You can't get any controlled experiments, but you can get close. Even, I say this because a lot of his support, God, I feel like such a weasel saying this, but it is important. A lot of people will say the white countries are wealthy and the black countries are impoverished, and that's pretty much all we need to know. Well, even if you just look at the Botswana-Zimbabwe example, by every metric, Botswana having more private property than Zimbabwe is doing better. Haiti and the Dominican Republic, they're like on the same island, And Haiti is not nearly as wealthy as the Dominican Republic. So in every race and every geographical area, it's important to point out wherever this experiment is done, we get more shit getting done
Yeah.
than we get in anything else.
It's always important to find the actual cause of something versus like the correlation you see with it.
Yeah, not easy. So here is his take on Hamilton. Would you mind reading this?
Sure. He quotes, he says, this is him talking. Hamilton, he's nominally just the Secretary of the Treasury. He's basically running everything. And Washington is running political interference for him. So you have the system, which is actually, it works a lot like a monarchy, which is like a company, a startup. It's like, do you drive a car? Your car was made by a monarchy. Do you go to a restaurant? Your restaurant is a monarchy. Every functional institution in the world has this very simple pyramid structure. End quote.
So again, Hamilton giving us the expansive commerce clause, which was later used to determine how much food you can grow on your own land, because that determines how much will be traded. If a lot's grown in Arizona, well, then that's going to affect commerce with other states. So this is the blank check sort of mindset that how do they get the state to have ultimate power? Well, they just rule things in a much more general way and promoting the general welfare, not to mention First Bank of the United States, the ideology that later gave us this central banking hellhole of monopolizing the currency in the worst way possible, not allowing for competition to keep the monarchs on their toes. So I'm not sure what else to say besides the fact that we've refuted the private versus public or coercive versus voluntary monarchy thing a hundred times.
Yeah.
So he continues to talk about Hamilton. He says, and Hamilton, created this monarchy, right? But of course, he goes out, does a stupid duel, and the system degrades. It basically falls apart, and it becomes more and more oligarchic. So we libertarians that are so often called, well, we sort of have this pie in the sky idea, and if everything's going okay, maybe you could have it, but if there's like a greedy monopolist, things will go bad. And because that's always going to happen, then, the system's just unrealistic. Well, here he says we had a monarch, Hamilton, and because of one death, so one person dies and the system degrades. And the guy had such bad judgment, he thought going into a duel with Aaron Burr would be beneficial. So we look at all the eggs you're putting in this one monarchical basket. The one that came to mind was Franz Ferdinand getting assassinated. So the story goes,
no bad consequences from that.
Exactly, that Serbian intelligence hired the Black Hand organization to assassinate the Archduke so he couldn't expand the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They have these demands which Serbia meets, but Austria still declares war, thinking they have a blank check from Germany. Russia mobilizes. Britain declares war because Germany invades France through Belgium based on an old treaty that Britain had. Britain needed the U.S., so they used the Lusitania as a justification to enter the war and killing all these people, giving us the Versailles Treaty, giving us the rise of Hitler in the Second World War. So please don't tell me that the free market's unstable and it's kind of like, people just eating Doritos and bad things happening. Right. Look at all this war and hell that the monarchs brought upon us. Shouldn't this great monarchical system of low time preference have stopped all this? Couldn't they have gotten together and shaken hands over anything? Final thoughts on one death away from degradation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant point, because it's like, we libertarians are always criticized for like, oh, well, you have this free market, but what happens when there's a mistake made, or what happens when, it coalesces into a state, these firms congregate into a state. And it's like, yeah, that's a possibility. I'll be honest, it's a possibility. It's true. It could happen, but it's that bad things could happen with every structure of government. And just like you said, with World War I, you had all these monarchies in World War I who just like fumbled. Like they fumbled everything in the worst catastrophic way you can imagine.
Moving on. Okay. So this is just a general pattern that I've seen where he'll say, look, we tried X doesn't work. He will only have that standard for either the voluntary sector or maybe democracy. So when the free market fails, it failed, and that's why we need to reject it. But when monarchy fails, we just need to reform it. It's actually a neutral tool. Well, can't I say either the free market works perfectly or there's shortcomings, in which case we should reform it, not throw the baby out with the bathwater? He doesn't give us, he says there's shortcomings, so we need this one. Well, there's shortcomings in everything. These are, gosh, what would you call it? I think I mentioned it later, but these are constants that apply in every circumstance. So he's not telling us the distinguishing feature of the monarchy, besides saying, well, it's a pyramid structure and all the great things, the restaurants and who makes your car monarchies.
Yeah,
but
it's acting as a bait and switch.
Differentiate.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on this? The reason I pull up the Khmer Rouge picture here is just because, I mean, prices go up in the free market, even though the Federal Reserve causes it, and immediately they blame greed. All the businesses in concert got greedy at the same time out of nowhere. But governments can commit mass genocide, and they'll be like, well, yes, we need reform. It's like that meme where the communist professor says, National Socialism is inherently evil. Communism, I think we need reform. It's such a good idea. We just need to reform it. This blatant double standard keeps showing up every time he discusses libertarianism.
Yeah, so like I see this all the time, even when I'm arguing on Twitter. But like, I can give the example of ancient Ireland, which was stateless for 2,000 years, and people say, well, where is it right now? It doesn't exist right now, so obviously anarchism doesn't work. Well, just as you showed in your previous slide, you have all those empires that are no longer with us. Where's Rome? What happened to the Roman Empire, right? So the fact that, if you're going to say that anarchism fails because this one anarchist society eventually failed after 2,000 years, what about all these monarchies who lasted far fewer years, right? Should we say that, well, I guess if anarchism doesn't work because you can point to an example or a number of examples where they're no longer with us, I can do the exact same for monarchy. So that argument just does not work. You can't play a double standard like that and expect it for it to be persuadable to most people.
And the other monarchs he refers to, he sort of says LBJ much more power than the presidency today, but not really. He says the big three are Hamilton, Lincoln, and FDR. When it comes to Lincoln, we've already gone over FDR. What would you say is the verdict on Lincoln and LBJ as far as net benefits or net negatives?
Yeah, well, I mean, Lincoln, who is probably up there for me on one of the top three worst presidents who ever existed, instituted slavery on a massive scale in the form of conscription and threw people into a meat grinder. He violated the Constitution. He would lock up people just expressing anti-war opinions. He would have their businesses or their press burned down if they were expressing anti-war opinions. He would institute the first income tax in America. He would, and of course, the Civil War, which did not need to happen, is just monstrous in its carnage and totality. You look at the actions of Sherman's march in the South, and it's horrific. LBJ, of course, gave us the Great Society, really the creation of the welfare state, and that has had disastrous effects on just the American population in general. It collectivized mutual aid and what would normally be considered social functions of like churches, mutual aid societies, and everything else into the state's purview. And because of that, the state now, in some sense, is seen as such an essential function of society that most people would be scared to ever think about even getting rid of the welfare state, because they genuinely think that, well, we need the welfare state because if we didn't have it, then everything would just collapse. People would be dying in the street. So and of course, there's so many things you can say about all these presidents, but those are the main things that come to mind immediately for me.
Exactly. And I'm sure that Yarvin is not necessarily like this anti-colonialist, but when it comes to, people advocating the Lincoln as, one of their tops, he was like the ultimate colonizer, these people fighting for their independence. Notice they never say, well, in Africa, the independence movements weren't inherently good. The anti-apartheid weren't necessarily good because they might have been replaced with something worse. So all of a sudden, they're the ones now who have the standard for, well, independence from foreign rule is sometimes good, sometimes bad. And in the Lincoln case, it was good because the benefits outweighed the cost. They never have that statement when it comes to any of the African countries leaving British imperial rule. And it changed the dynamic of the country. Is it a country that has states or states that formed a country? That gets us into so much. And of course, 600,000 deaths, much higher than a percentage of the population than alleged COVID deaths that we have now. And of course, COVID was like the ultimate proof libertarianism can't work for 2 months until they looked at the genome, only to find this does not look like it was created in nature. Oh, look, well, what's that? The first cases happened to be 900 kilometers away from the closest bat cave in Wuhan, and it was actually people who happened to work at the lab. What are the chances? So, of course, turns out the government not only overreacted, but created this virus. LBJ, yeah, the Gulf of Tonkin. These people both lied us into wars and enslaved millions of men, only to be told that they have male privilege later on. The worst form, of course, Medicare and Medicaid, changing the healthcare system from a consumer-based industry where companies have to please consumers. Now they focus more on pleasing governments, and that's why healthcare costs are through the roof. Civil rights movement, forced association, just terrible. His examples of here are the monarchs, and monarchy is good. We have to recognize that the worst are the monarchs here. Again, he equivocates with Thaddeus Russell. Just tell me if there's anything what we can add to this that hasn't already been said. Yarvin says, if you drive a car, your car was made by a monarchy. Imagine the Department of Transportation trying to make electric cars and compare it to Elon Musk. Anything there?
Yeah. So I actually have a lot to say about this piece. So equivocation, for people who don't know, equivocation is when you use the same word, but you use it in two different ways and generally the same argument or same structure, right? So, and this, I also want to go into a little detail and explain what I think Yarvin is doing here, unintentionally. I'm not assuming malice here. I think he's engaging in what's called a Mott-Bailey fallacy. So what the Mott-Bailey fallacy is you have a Mott, it's essentially when you propose a commonsensical, uncontroversial proposition in your first half, and then you do an equivocation on the later half called the Bailey, and you switch it to an extremely narrow, controversial claim. So an example of this would be like if Yarvin is saying that these companies are just like monarchies, right? They're like they have a CEO at the top, they have someone at the top, and then it's structured downward from there, right? Okay. You could say that they're structured like a monarchy in the sense that they imitate a monarchy, but when he goes and then tries to say therefore the government should be right, therefore if monarchy is okay for a business, well, then it should be okay for a government too, or that they're the same thing in any way. It's not the case at all. In a private property scheme, you could say that you are the monarch of your property, but that doesn't imply that monarchy in a governmental sense is the same thing as monarchy in a private property sense. They're not the same thing, and I think the equivocation is very dangerous.
Yeah, and to just take his concept of the monarchy being justified. I don't know how else to say it besides, well, if someone went up to you and started declaring that he was the king of you, didn't care about your consent, as no monarch does, would you, like if he just started regulating Yarvin's Substack and saying you can report on this, would Yarvin say, oh, thank God, finally, I'm under the rule of someone's long-term low time preference. This is terrific. I mean, if this thing is so inherently good, why is it only a state that can have this rule? Well, one of the things that I'm thinking will come to mind is he can say, well, how about Raytheon or even Elon Musk that got a lot of government subsidies? So the distinguishing between private and public is sort of like this fake thing that only the childish ANCAP still believes in. Well, what he's not doing is recognizing that there is still a difference in potential, and there are explicit differences. I mean,
Yes.
even if there is some overlap in some societies at some points, we still have this conceptual difference. So yes, the government at this point with trillions of dollars and all these regulatory agencies technically affects everyone and everything, but so does the Catholic Church. That doesn't mean we can't narrow down the Catholic Church effects and whether or not its statements are true and it's a good organization. Language affects everything. I mean, what other institutions just about? Oh, this is what the 1619 Project does with racism. That anything that exists indirectly was the result of something in the cotton industry, which was the result of slavery. Therefore, literally everything it can be tied to racism. So if there is a nail that was used to make shoes that the slaves wore in the on the plantations, well, then the nail industry and everything that touches it, well, that all counts towards slave GDP, and that's how you can come up with like cotton was like 90% of the American economy. That's how their calculations go. They engage in what Jason Brennan referred to as double accounting. Of course, it goes back to Renaissance Italy, and it's an old term. But the point is that Brennan was the one who made the long case that was their major fallacy.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, the equivocation is very dangerous. I just wanted to say that it would be like saying, like, if I have a blue pen and a blue car, we can compare the blueness, right? We can compare the two aspects that they're both blue, but that ignores the differences that are fundamental, right? And I know he's not saying that these things are, I don't think he's trying to say that they're exactly the same, but in his implication, he's sort of implying that, well, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, which is not the same when you consider like what a firm is. But when you consider like what the structure of a governance is in an internal aspect versus what a government is, because the government is affects things external from itself. So I think that's the major distinction.
He then mentions to Thaddeus Russell that if you look at we can't just say private incentive good, public disincentive bad, because two of the biggest engineering projects of all time were the Manhattan Project and the Apollo Project. Were these done by that private sector? No. So notice how he calls the plot to indiscriminately engage in mass murder the Manhattan Project, as opposed to the mass murderous A-bomb. Of course, you would not. That is just like what a show to distract from. Hey, it was really big. Was it beneficial? Was it negative? I mean, doesn't the effects of the thing matter if we're caring about consumers benefiting from the existence of a monarchy or a democracy or the citizens? Well, it matters what the thing is. What is your response to the Manhattan Project and Apollo? And we could even steelman them and say DARPA giving us interconnected networks to communicate in the event of a nuclear crisis, and that is what we today call the internet.
Yeah, sure. So I would say, first of all, the Manhattan Project spawned, as you were saying, like one of the single biggest events of mass murder in a single event, right? Like this is nothing to be proud of in any sense. So I find it funny he's using that example, because it's like, look, if the biggest engineering projects is that you're building bombs, right? So this is supposed to be some marvel, some big thing we're supposed to look at. It's like, it seems to me, not even if you take out the morality of the issue, the idea that you're putting all this engineering into blowing it up seems to be a complete waste of value, right? From just an economic perspective. So the fact that, okay, we're going to put all this money and all these resources into a bomb that's going to just destroy things, it's like that's not generating wealth in any sense, right? That you're just throwing something away, and you're doing worse than throwing it away. You're throwing something away in an aspect where it's going to kill hundreds of thousands of people in a single explosion. So that's terrible. As far as the Apollo project, there were close to 400,000 private contractors a part of the Apollo program, right? So you could say that in some sense it was, a waste. I'm sure there's an emotional aspect to it, but ultimately doing this, it showed what we could do, so that's good. But ultimately, it was still done by many private individuals, and who's to say that that was the best use of resources? Perhaps we could have done it in other ways. And if you look at SpaceX now, private companies are doing this, so they're doing it on their own dime. So whenever you're trying to say, well, look at all these marvelous engineering projects we did, if you don't have the ability, if you're government, if you're looking at the government's engineering projects, you're like, okay, how could this money have been spent in other areas, right? You always have to imagine, the opportunity costs here, what was lost by committing this action.
Yeah, if you want to go to the moon or go anywhere, just voluntarily fund it, please. Just let people opt out. Why is this such a hassle for us to have the same standards for others that
Right.
we have? This is like the most basic thing, and they just continue to reject it. The A bomb. So you have the result, which is indiscriminate mass murder. But then what conservatives, what Dennis Prager's of the world would say is, well, sorry, but that's the kind of leverage you need in reality. Just like the gun, this can't be uninvented. So yes, even though the Rosenbergs then gave it to the Soviets, it was going to be invented anyway. The Germans were working on it, and now we need it. Well, in the Yarvinian response to this could be a bad thing because less monarchical America had more leverage against more monarchical Soviet Union, China today, Russia today. Comparing Russia today to America as far as which one is more of a monarchy, certainly places like Iran and North Korea are more monarchical than America. So if it's good that we had the Manhattan Project, then he's also saying it's good that less monarchy, America, had more leverage over monarchies like the Soviets, the Chinese today, North Koreans today, and Iran today, where alcohol is still illegal. So I don't see how any of this adds up to him making a really good point. I think it's just
Right.
look at what can be done. So whether it's good or bad, big thing can happen. Therefore, we should recognize the legitimacy and do other good things with this.
And on DARPA for a second, they always say, well, the government invented the internet. No, not really, because if you actually look at it, they hired the people who were already building the substrate that would become DARPA and the internet already. So like private people, private engineers were already working on this type of stuff, and they essentially just got co-opted into a state project. So it's not that, well, without the state, we never have internet. That's not true.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing is that when you have an organization this big, it's not like, well, what does a company like Epson printers? You can kind of gauge the number of people who use the printers and what those things are, what's printed, and who the consumers are of the stuff that's printed. Even though it's kind of hard because there's a big chain. Who reads the books? What value do they get from the books? So it's hard to really gauge the value of the Epson company just by looking at numbers. Well, now imagine if instead of a, relatively big but small in the span of things company, instead you have a government that has trillions of dollars every year that it taxes and redistributes. Of course, they're going to affect directly or indirectly anything. If you gave the Koch brothers a magic money printing machine and the right to tax and regulate, then the Koch brothers would be making things like the Manhattan Project, and they could, fund one thing that later became the Apple computer, or they could regulate an industry in such a way that later resulted in something good, like wireless routers or something like that. If you give anyone this much power and this much money, yes, good things are going to happen. If you shoot money out of a helicopter,
Right.
some people are going to catch it, spend it on things, and they're going to benefit. That doesn't mean, hey, we should have a general rule of shooting money out of a helicopter, but only a
Right.
monopoly can have it. And this might be his strongest point, that look at what can be done through government monarchies, and I still don't think it holds up.
Yeah.
Here we have the pencil analogy, which he gives to Thaddeus Russell. I tried to summarize this the best that I could. So, in other words, when things are going well, you can have small or no state or center of massive disproportionate power is necessary. If things get really bad, such power becomes necessary to reestablish an equilibrium. Wow, even my summary was bad, and I spent like 5 minutes trying to write that. So he's saying, if you have a pencil and it sort of wobbles, you don't need much power to pick it up. Well, imagine if it's now a telephone pole. A telephone pole, if it's up straight, you can put your hand on it and actually hold this thing up. But if the telephone pole, the pole being society, if it's on its side, you can't. You need a crane. You need something with a lot of power. In this case, if society is totally just degradation everywhere, total degeneracy, yeah, you need a big monarch, heavy state, very powerful. So just because libertarianism is true under normal circumstances, that does not mean it's true in emergency circumstances, and we cannot engage in passive action. Thoughts on the pencil analogy?
Yeah, so there's a couple things I think there's wrong with this. So it's true in some sense. His analogy speaks to the fact that it's almost a tautology where it's like, yeah, when things are going good, they're going good, right? Like, obviously, most systems can survive when most things are going good for them. That's just true. It's a truism. So when he says, well, the power, when the telephone pole falls down, and that being, an analogy for society, you need some stronger power to pick it up. Well, I don't think his analogy accounts for the fact that what happens when the state is in a state of chaos, for lack of a better term, right? What happens when things are going terrible in the state, or what happens when an outside monarch or an outside state tries to take over that state, right? So the fact that I think I would disagree with his point that, well, you need this powerful structure, this state, to pick it back up, right? So you might say you need some form of organizing principle or some sort of organizing structure to pick the telephone pole back up, but that alone doesn't imply a state. That just implies some organizing structure with power. So there's no reason it has to be a monopoly on violence. And also, his analogy doesn't preclude the fact that the state itself could suffer from that very predicament, that the state itself could be the telephone pole falling down.
Exactly. If the falling pole is society in decay, states have caused decay since the beginning of time. Anyone trying to monopolize territory they haven't justly acquired through original appropriation or voluntary exchange, that has been chaotic since, I don't know, forever. So to pin this on the market, I mean, you could just say, yeah, monarchy's good when everything's going well, and the guy's not too tyrannical. But look, if things get bad and the monarch is a tyrant, like in North Korea or Chairman Mao or Joseph Stalin or something, you just can't have that. So that's when you need the power of the free market, decentralized information, freedom of association. That's how you pick up the telephone pole. I don't see how this is anything that uniquely applies negatively to the voluntary sector. Again, also he uses the term passive action. So you can't just have passive action. Passive pretty much assumes a person standing still and things just passing them. So he's assuming that non-state, that people aren't acting in the absence of a state. There's no one who's ambitious. Jeff Bezos couldn't have been ambitious to lower the price of books to the point where I have access to more information than most of the kings throughout history. That, because that wasn't done by a monarch, that's just passive.
Right. Yeah. This is like, I'm sure I don't want to assume malice. I assume this is intentional, but comes across to me as the most straw man of all his positions, this idea of passive action. It's like, I've never heard any libertarian or any anarchist thinker that thinks we'll just flip a switch and then it'll be on autopilot or something like that. It just discounts the idea of entrepreneurship in like a Misesian theory in the first place, right? Entrepreneurs are not passive actors. They're problem solvers, which in turn generates value for people, which in turn implies that they are directed towards actions and ends. And means that would complement or get them to those ends. So this idea of passive action, I don't know where that comes from, quite honestly.
Yeah, the entrepreneur is the great example, but even an ambitious employee.
Yeah, right. Anyone can do it.
Or someone who's just like very caring. I guess, very wanting to. I really want to help the poor. We're gonna, build St. Mary's Food, and I think is the name of the place in Phoenix. I mean, that could be, trying to pick up the worst parts of society, the people in most vulnerable positions, let's call it. That could be trying to reestablish the poll through the voluntary sector. So if he's just looking for, sometimes you need heavily centralized power, since again he doesn't like to differentiate between the voluntary sector and the alternative. You could have churches. The story of Jesus. Are there any Christian? Are there any theocracies in the world, like explicitly, or just in practice? I mean, I guess Iran.
I mean, I guess you could count the Vatican in some sense as
yeah, really, the Vatican. So the churches have the ability to influence people heavily. Look at the amount of money that churches raise. People go there once or twice a week, and churches make tons and tons of money by people choosing to give. I mean, talk about if schools could be privatized, how much money they could raise. Look, the people who want to give, give. If you don't want to give and just go for free, the church is happy to have you. So churches, companies like Odyssey, that is an example of non-passive action, of ambition, trying to lift up the pole of censorship from YouTube. And you have thought leaders, John Locke, Martin Luther King, you have Gandhi. These people are widely recognized, of course. I think people like Molyneux and Rothbard would of course fall in there. And then I of course there's still downsides of this heavily centralized power, such as genocide, mass starvation. There's no correcting mechanism. They could contribute to poverty and misery. So any final thoughts on? I think this is just part one of. Any thoughts on the pencil analogy further?
Yeah, I think that you pretty much summarized it beautifully, because it's like also I would just end with for one, I think the most annoying thing about this part is that he equivocates power to assume state power. Like it just like power. You don't have to have state power to have power, right? The power is in some sense it's not exclusive to the state. So going off that your example at the bottom here. When the state falls into chaos, what happens when the state itself is the pole that falls down, right? Well, do you need another state to pick that up? Well, what if that pole falls down? Do you need another state to pick that state up? It's like, you kind of get into this infinite regress where there's no actual solution. And you just had, and that's, the market decentralization is in some sense the best solution, because there's always someone else out there. There's always another entrepreneur out there trying to solve the problem better than the last entrepreneur.
Oh yes, certainly. If you look at like the problem, if we think of a major problem being ignorance, certainly places like Barnes and Noble, Andrew Carnegie establishing the first libraries in America, that we still have ambitious people who can have a disproportionate amount of power. And it's good that the smart people have more power in certain sectors, for the same reason that it's good that people can buy a lot more Adele CDs than Keith Knight CDs, which are never going to exist. So even though there's drastic inequality and she has so much power, one Adele tweet could change what people are talking about all over the planet, whereas my tweets, try as I may, doesn't exactly do that. You can still have massive power centers. He continues with the pencil analogy, saying, moreover, the further your pencil gaps from top dead center, imagine now your pencil is the size of a telephone pole. Sorry, I did not time this correctly. Right, the farther your pencil, you can actually hold it that steady within your hand. If you're at the top of it, you could hold that telephone pole with a pencil point on it. If you let it fall over, you're going to need some heavy equipment to pick it back up. So consider that just being the clarification. All right, next we have his criticism of the free market of ideas. He says, one of the ideas that got me away from anarcho-capitalism, this is in a video titled Marketplace of Ideas, is the idea that the principle that sovereignty, energy is conserved, there is always someone in power, has never really been violated. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually have some pretty good, or a lot of thoughts on this actually. So first, I would, addressing his free market of ideas criticism, I would agree that the free market, and I think most libertarians and anarchists would agree, the free market on ideas does not, we're not saying that the best idea wins, right? we would say the most dominant idea would win generally. But the whole concept of the free market of ideas is that decentralized actors are going to try different things, and when they fail, the costs are localized to them mostly. In an actual free market, the costs are localized to them mostly, and we can learn from their mistakes, right? So it's not to say that if we thought a free market of ideas meant the best ideas would win, we would think that libertarianism would be dominant right now, right? So that's not what we're saying.
Yes.
So down to his idea of that, so he's making an analogy here with physics. So the first law of thermodynamics is the conservation of energy, right? Energy is always just transferred, or it's conserved, sorry, and it never actually changes. It never it's never gone. It's just transformed from one form to the other. So right here, he's talking about like how society. So if we assume that, so what he means here, what he's trying to imply here is that you can never get rid of the power structures of a society. You can only transform them from one form to the other, and it's constant. So if we assume that the value of power in a given geographic area is like X, let's say, right? Well, we can still have that. Does not preclude anarchism. So how this could work is that even if you assume that the power is conserved, you can divide that power infinitely, depending on like the structure of the society itself. So an example about this, right, is if I'm playing pool, and I have the pool cue and I hit the cue ball into a group of other balls on the table, the amount of power, the amount of force I used to shoot the cue ball into the other balls, and if it hits them simultaneously, the power is from the original cue ball, the momentum is dispersed to all the others. It's divided, right? So the fact that power in a society, if he believes that power in the society is conserved, that doesn't at all imply, not in any form, that it's going to be conserved in the form of a state, right? So you can think about this in the ways of so I'll explain a little about like what so theoretically in a decentralized society, what you want is a rhizome. So a rhizome is like a root system of a plant, of certain types of plants. It's a horizontal root system where each and every single part of the root system can branch off, and they connect to the different nodes on the system. And what this means is ultimately you have a structure where there's no centralized structure to it. So when there's no like place you can like put power or put pressure on it that would collapse the whole system. So this is the weakness of centralized systems, that if you conserve power in a centralized system, what you're going to do is you're going to make that you're putting all your eggs in one basket essentially, and that's the point of attack. In a decentralized system, power is dispersed through all the different nodes and all the different connections people make. And every node can connect to any other node at any given time. So that is why a decentralized system can still conserve power essentially in a given society, but you don't have to conserve it in a way where it's a monopolistic state.
Yeah, this again comes from the concept of, if we want this goal, the good idea, even if you disagree on what the good ideas are, what process would you want? Which set of rules would you want in a society to hopefully get those best ideas? Would it be, let's just compare monarchy to more of a free market in ideas. So when he says something like, well, the average person who believes in democracy is ignorant, so taking away their vote or their voice is not really that big. The problem is you don't know who the people are in advance. Just like in sales, you waste 80% of your time sometimes.
Yes.
So why did you waste the 80 and not just do the 20? Well, at the time when you're starting, you don't know which 20% of people you're going to hit with. So you don't know which ideas are going to be best. That's why you need to embrace the principle of free market in exchange of ideas as opposed to coercively funded one, to increase the likelihood you'll come across that good idea. He uses it sort of just pleases us to think that it's sort of like Bitcoin, no one's really in charge. Well, still, this would be his monarchy idea of Satoshi Nakamoto, whether that was one person or a team. That would be the monarch in the monarch delegating power and this power transforming, just like he says,
Right.
FDR used to have a lot of power. Now the cathedral has the power. It can still change. So the fact that it can change doesn't rule out that you could still have a system where people don't recognize some people as having the right to violently dominate others and unilaterally issue contracts. Strongest ideas versus Darwinian ideal selection. Yeah, that was just the general topic for this. He had mentioned that people don't want freedom; they just want power, and this excites their inner chimpanzee. Well, if people just want power, make sure you don't have a monarch we can't disassociate with. I don't know. I don't know what else to tell you. Every shortcoming. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
no, you're fine. You're fine.
My point is, every shortcoming in this free market of ideas, yeah, there's going to be a ton of garbage. Well, there's also a ton of garbage when the monarchs are calling the shots. So that's not enough of a criticism to rule out giving people what Kant would call treating them as an end in and of themselves.
Yes.
Yeah. Most ideas are trash, he says, which I agree with. You could, but Malice says 99% of everything is trash. Podcasts, movies, shows, authors, leaders, journalists, actors, voters, politicians, most are trash. It's that 1%. And the marketplace of ideas process, just like the sales analogy that I used, that's how you find that better 1%. Thoughts on most ideas are trash, therefore monarchy of ideas is superior to a marketplace?
Yeah, so like you can agree most ideas are trash, but the reason we kind of know most ideas are trash is because we've gone through the marketplace of ideas in the first place to determine which things like serve a utility function and which do not, right? So it's because we are knowledgeable about this. So the whole critique implies the existence of the marketplace of ideas working in the first place, right? So I think it's kind of a weird critique. It's ignoring the system he's building his premise off of.
He says the system purports to yield good ideas. Does it?
I don't think.
I want to see if that. I was going to say that's his premise before his conclusion. Is that premise even true? Good ideas? No. Better than the alternative and still morally justified? Yes.
Well, I think when he's talking about marketplace of ideas, like he says that it purports to yield good ideas. Well, in some sense, I would disagree that it purports to yield good ideas, right? It's just a way of people trying to like discover like which ideas would serve my personal utility. Do you know what I mean? And so it's not even best in like a moral good sense. It's just trying to see, okay, from a market incentive, from just a purely market incentive, what ideas don't like blow up in my face, that type of stuff.
Yes. And then he goes on to say, the question is, can it be hacked? So in other words, we claim to have this system, but if it could be hacked by, journalists or liars or self-interested people, well, then we don't have the system we thought we had, and therefore we're not really advocating what we think we're advocating. Yes, it can be hacked technically with good ideas or bad ideas or overrun by good people or bad people, just like monarchy can. This is not a criticism of allowing people to talk freely.
Right. Yeah, you could have a bad monarch, and now right. You could have any sort, or you could have a monarch who is influenced by bad people. So it's just his criticism like boomerangs right back at him on his idea.
Well, that's not true. You can't have a bad monarch. Take that back. Take it back.
That's right.
But bad people only exist in the voluntary sector.
That's right. Yeah.
When you can go to someone else or seek alternatives. He says that there's a problem with modern society. People are unwilling to serve a master. Why we need a monarch, but they are willing to serve a mechanism. Now, this I think is a very productive idea that people might. I guess we should just talk about Americans because that's probably who he's referring to. If you say to the average person, you need someone like Bill Mitchell mind control level to say that which is justified is that which Trump does. You really have to go search far and wide. The average person I don't think would say Biden has the right to rule me, Trump has the right to rule me. They say it's this mechanism called democracy where the president sits. That's where the right to rule is. So I think this is a good point that he makes.
Yes.
You see this as a problem, or what are your takeaways on this?
I think I agree with you. I think it's a good analysis because I do think because it's impersonal. If people feel they're being ruled by a mechanism or they're serving a mechanism as opposed to a person, there's less emotional tie, or there's less feeling of another person encroaching upon you, right? It's like, well, we're just a part of this system. And when my taxes get taken from me or something, that's just the system working. It's not this guy holding me up in a back alley robbing my money.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good point. Not sure how it refutes our position, but he says people have a Luciferian idea. Since they were 4 years old, they were told that they are perfect. They are the king. You're a free man. You don't deserve to serve anyone. You don't have to serve anyone. I don't even know if that's true, because I remember as a young kid, true. You have to obey your elders, and you have to obey your parents, and you get spanked if you don't, or you get yelled at, or you're a bad kid, or you get grounded, or you have to obey the teacher so you can get the good grades. I don't see this at all. But of course we've gone from children to Luciferian, so maybe that's an increase in the last hour or so.
Right. Yeah, this statement by him is one of the most odd to me, because it's just I think undeniably untrue. Like, people grow up and they grow up in an incredibly structured way. Like, from their 4 years old on, like, you're going to kindergarten, you're going to school, and the first thing you learn in school is submission to authority, right? Like, kids are given like they're assessed with psychological disorders when they're not able to respect the authority of teachers, and they're given drugs, right, to make them more susceptible to just following the structure of the school itself. So yeah, I think this is completely backwards. People are told from a very young age that, one, they have to follow the school, they have to listen to the teacher, and not only that, they are also told through their school years that you're a part of this system that we call democracy in America, and it's your job to imagine yourself as a little tyrant and imagine yourself, okay, what do I want, and let me put a vote in to get what I want, even if it's going to involve other people losing, right? So that's how they're taught to think about the system in the first place. So Yarvin's statement here, I don't even understand how he could think this, quite honestly. I don't see, I'm not seeing the point.
So I guess Luciferian in the sense of you are a god, you are the light bearer, you are the enlightened, and you are enlightened, therefore entitled to more than what you actually are. Doesn't that sound exactly like monarchy? The Luciferian idea that, you know what, other people don't matter. I'm the ruler here. I call the shots. Screw everyone else. I'm not humble enough to let people disassociate from me. That's how smart I am. That's how valuable I am to everyone else. I'm so enlightened. I'm so brilliant. My ideas get to be forced on others. When people do it to me, it's evil terrorism and they go to jail. When I do it to others, I'm engaged in a low time preference. He finishes by saying, there's an old Prussian saying that people need to appreciate, that is, those who wish to command must first learn to obey. So in other words, the ANCAP's going around telling people the rights, the right way to live is self-ownership, voluntary exchange. Well, they're trying to call the shots in society. You first have to learn to obey. Don't be afraid to obey people. The reason this pisses me off is because, again, he has to freaking know. As someone who's read Rothbard, Conceived in Liberty, that's more than anatomy in the state. That's dedication. You have to know that my hatred of one group called the Congress group or the cops group, well, talk about being 4 years old. You have to blindly obey the cops and do what you're told by them. But if I don't like this group called Walmart or Amazon or government, that doesn't mean I'm against obeying anyone or taking any commandments. I mean, it would probably shock him, if he really believes this, to see that I have references from previous employers, because we just hate obeying and we just want to be Lucifer, doing our own thing everywhere. That's not the case at all. Just because I hate this group, you don't want to blindly obey the Church of Scientology. Well, let me tell you, Curtis, those who wish to command must first learn to obey. So I hate this group and I like other groups. It's not against obeying or following rules. It's this group of mass murdering liars. You don't obey the New York Times. Well, if you wish to command, you must first learn. This is so ridiculous.
Roderick Long says, and I think he summarizes anarchism beautifully, which he says, anarchism is essentially the idea that other people are not your property and you're not allowed to treat them as your property, right? So the whole idea of him of this saying like, well, we're just trying to, we just want to be king, we just want to do whatever we want no matter the cost, is like, no. The whole point of why I'm an anarchist is I believe other people have boundaries that I'm not allowed to encroach on, and you're not allowed to encroach on them either, right? So the idea is that if we were just a king, we wouldn't care about other people's boundaries. If we were really a monarchist, we would not care about the subject's boundaries.
Great points. And yeah, the final thing on the marketplace of ideas, I think what he might be hearing when people like Dave Rubin say it is that every idea is equal and should be equally heard.
Oh, yeah.
That is not it at all. Like I support a marketplace in, well, ideas, I guess is what we're saying, but I believe in a marketplace of communication, which means Curtis Yarvin gets a lot more views on YouTube videos when he doesn't even have a channel. It's other people uploading his stuff. He has a lot more than probably I could ever dream of. His Substack readers and his what was his first blog called? Unqualified Reservations.
Yeah.
That has more readers than I'm ever going to have. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's still a marketplace where people with a lot more intelligence who went to Brown should probably have a bigger than someone like me. So that is not in any way a refutation of, the marketplace of ideas. He goes on to say in why libertarians should be monarchists, libertarians really think they have the solution of, who will watch the Watchmen, right? And they're like, we don't need any Watchmen. It's completely automatic. We just flip a switch. How do you respond?
I don't know where he is, what libertarians he's reading or where he's getting that from. I've never known a libertarian to just assume that, well, it's an automatic system. We're just going to flip a switch. And directly to his point about, well, we think we've solved who watches the Watchmen. The point of that is that there's no good answer to that question, right? That's implicit in the who watches the Watchmen. The implicit nature is that there's no perfect answer, right? It's in some sense an inescapable infinite regress. But because it's an inescapable infinite regress, what you want is as many Watchmen as possible watching each other, and that's what you get with decentralization. You have a system where everyone is going to be responsive in some sense, just because of the way markets work and the way information travels. You're going to be responsive to informational changes within the market depending on people's actions. So it's true that we're not saying that once we just get to like a decentralized anarchist society or something, we're not saying that, well, it's just all going to be perfect. The point is that there will be problems. Of course, there'll be problems. Because if there weren't problems, if it was just automatic, we wouldn't spend so much time talking about court systems and security and all this, right? So obviously, we're accounting for the fact that there will be problems. So for the watch, we don't need any watchmen. No, we do need watchmen. We need a lot of them. In fact, we need a market full of them watching each other. Right? That's the best way to secure it. Is it foolproof? No. There's no way to escape the who watches the Watchmen answer sufficiently. So what you want is as many as possible watching each other.
Yeah, I've not only never heard we don't need any Watchmen, I haven't even heard anything remotely like this in all the years that I've been in ANCAP. I guess when he says something automatic, it's much like he said previously, passive action.
Yeah.
I don't know. None of them support that either. Automatic. Yeah. They don't say nothing needs to happen, to be fair, if people, when they say spontaneous order, a lot of new libertarians who have only read Hayek, RIP to their brains if you've only read Hayek, they might literally be saying, no one needs to do something. The market takes care of itself.
Yes.
I actually think I heard Bill O'Reilly say that, but that's classic simpleton nonsense. Yeah. In the same way, I'd never go up to a random monarchist and try to, refute them with Ace Archist for 2 hours. I try to take the best of the best. So if he could not straw man us, that would be nice. When it comes to the Watchmen, my position, my understanding of the ANCAP position has always been Watchmen exist. Whether you think a Watchman is a bad actor or just a powerful person, Watchmen always exist.
Yes.
So recognizing that reality, under which system can society get the most benefits out of the watchman, and which society or set of rules gives us a correcting mechanism to best limit the negative reach of a bad watchman, like Kissinger or Brzezinski or Madeleine Albright. So we don't need any. I don't believe that, and I have yet to meet anyone who believes.
I mean,
that,
you can structure it like, there's this concept of like the prison structure, like a panopticon, where you have all the prisoners can see each other, and the watchman at the top can see all the prisoners, but none of the prisoners can see the watchman. So that is analogous to a state, what you would have with a state. With the decentralized system, you have it where it's like it's kind of like a spider web or nodes on a decentralized point. Everyone can see everyone else in most cases. So the decentralized system has obvious advantages in my view.
Yeah, and monopoly watchmen, which a monarchist would advocate, you could still have other technical watchmen, but the monarch, by definition, has to have rules that apply to it uniquely.
Yes.
All of the shortcomings of, well, the average, the non-state actor might do this terrible thing. Again, all of those biases, just like when they say, well, we need social media regulated, or we need the market regulated so bad ideas don't get out, or something like that.
Yeah.
Every criticism of the average person applies not only to the watchmen, they're just as biased, they're just as self-interested, regardless of what they say. But that's like level one. That's if we randomly distributed government titles. Who gets attracted to that kind of position? People like Larry Summers, just explicit liars, president of Harvard, secretary of the Treasury under Clinton. People like Kamala Harris, who think it's like really funny to be on a debate stage and say, Joe Biden, you were opposed to busing and this is terrible and racist. And then Stephen Colbert asks her, how can you be vice president to someone you had such blatant disagreements with? And she starts cackling for a change and says, it was a debate. It was in the title, debate. That's what we're doing there. Like, they just explicitly lie so much that that's who's attracted to that kind of position. That's why monarchy watchman is worse than free market watchman.
That's right. Yeah. What you don't want is in some sense, people talk about like time preferences that, well, you want a lower time preference. Well, it's like, in some sense, you want a lower time preference in the production of goods, but lower time preference in the production of bads can also be just as bad as erratic bad behavior. So you just have to kind of make sure you're separating those two things.
And again, the Austrian would say, sometimes you want low, sometimes you want high. So the best way to find that equilibrium is the market process instead of the political process, where people more or less pay no penalty for bad decisions. In fact, they often get rewarded. 9/11 happens on Bush's watch, and his approval goes to 91%. I mean, just so ridiculous. Yarvin continues, the idea that you could build a system without any sort of that would just run by itself. But of course, when we actually see it, it doesn't seem to really work like that. How do you respond to that?
It's a non-point to me. It's like, it's not actually addressing what at least the libertarians I've been reading for 10 years, it's not addressing anything they've ever said. It's hard for me to address a point I don't hold myself, because I don't think that it can just run by itself, as if it's just so like I don't even know what that would mean, a system running by itself. Like, you always need some input from people to get some output. It's like, I don't know how much more I can say about that than what I've already said. I think he's just incorrect here.
On the most basic level, anytime an employee makes a decision to get a raise, try to get more training, look for a different job, that is a person acting and trying to change the system not just running by itself where people are passive. And then the biggest one, which you mentioned previously, any entrepreneur engaging in postponing consumption and capital investment is an actor. But it literally seems like he's saying, if there's no violence, if there's no state, then people aren't acting. So no violence equals no actors. But that's not the case at all. People acting in the realm of voluntary contracts and harmonious associations. So this is just not what we're talking about. He then goes on to say, since you can't dispense with power, how should power actually work? And you basically get outside the libertarian regime. And then you're like, oh, the libertarian regime is just a special case of when this is going really well and it isn't effed up and everything is working fine. You don't get that telephone pole lifted up by taking your hand off it. So we're back to the pencil analogy.
Yeah, I think this is just an equivocation again. Like, I think that's been the constant throughout all this. Whenever Yarvin or sometimes people in Yarvin's footsteps mention power, I just see it as an equivocation, because the libertarian position is not we're against power. Because if you define power in a very general sense, my ability to exert myself on my external environment requires power. My ability to defend my rights requires power. I am exerting power by speaking. I'm exerting power by like incorporating the external resources of this world into my ongoing projects and means, right? So we're not against power. We're against a certain way that power is used on individuals and their property. So go ahead.
I was just going to, and it's not like it's so utopian to where, well, what happens, everyone has to read Lou Rockwell and then develop the Austrian theory of power analysis. It's literally extend the principles you have for the average person to either the church or your family or the state, especially in the case that we're discussing here. So it's not some pie in the sky. It could be a special case in the sense of statism has mostly existed throughout history, but because it is within human grasp, really, and military conscription and no property rights for women or whatever. The idea that even if it is a special case doesn't mean that it's something so like far out of the ordinary. I mean, the telephone is like something way more complex and bizarre. But after enough time, when I say telephone, sun, computer, microphone, Monster energy drink, people are so accustomed to hearing that we're on the same page because they know of that thing as well. To the point where we could say non-aggression principle and people will have a general understanding and recognition of what that means. Just over time, even though no one knew what microphone, computer, monster, ceiling fan were 300 years ago. Oh, it's just a special case. Microphones seldom exist. So what? So things can change, just like he wants to change us into a hereditary monarchy. Things can change for the better towards a market.
That's right. Yeah. So Brian Kaplan actually talks about this, like how, most people have this moral intuition of the nap. They have a moral intuition of like when you ask them on a case by case basis, they'll say that, well, I'm against, I think that assaulting that person was wrong, or I think stealing that person was wrong, or that person's property was wrong. What distinguishes libertarians is libertarians engage in what would be considered overlearning, which is we take these truths or these moral intuitions we experience that murder is wrong, rape is wrong, theft is wrong, and we expand them out into all the boundaries where they would logically apply, right? So, like, there's no, like, libertarians aren't some other creation or creature. We just follow them. We just follow the moral intuitions most everyone has to its logical conclusion. That's really it, to be quite honest.
And Larkin Rose's point is not that, God, we got to teach people about healthcare and then education and then agricultural subsidies. He goes, really, it's actually unlearning something, which is the belief in political authority or anything illegitimate, which anyone in like any society, even if you have like no practiced property rights. David Friedman's, I love David Friedman's point about this. He goes, we see it in birds, we see it in animals, protection of property and protection of self, and people immediately defending themselves. So you don't get to say, well, this is a thing that John Locke invented and the Koch brothers are just carrying on arbitrarily. Any day now we could lose it just as soon as we gained it. No, it's in animals. It's pretty much in everything. And as far as things getting effed up, so to speak, well, you don't get to say things are effed up, therefore we need a state and libertarianism is bad. If you look at this is the Eric Garner case, of course. The guy who murdered him got he now works a desk job and got a raise. Look at all the effed up stuff that exists as a causal result of there being a state.
Look at the 20th century.
Yeah, really. So we have what is called the iron law of oligarchy. I thought he did a great job with summarizing this in the interview he did on my show. This is referred to. So this is the reason. Why did I bring this up eventually? I know I put it in for some reason. I think the reason is that Matthew Raphael Johnson, the PhD, always says that most disagreements are regarding the meaning of terms. I think with either Yarvin or a lot of his supporters, a lot of his substackers, they recognize the iron law of oligarchy as we do, and they confuse this for a justification of monarchy. This is something Richard Wolff never is able to understand. That's why his picture's here. The iron law of oligarchy is a political theory first developed by German-born Italian sociologist Robert Nickels in his 1911 book, Political Parties. It asserts that rule by an elite or oligarchy is inevitable as an iron law within any democratic organization as part of a tactical and technical necessities of organization. Nickels' theory states that all complex organizations, regardless of how democratic they are when they started, eventually develop into oligarchies. Nickels observed that since no sufficiently large and complex organization can function purely as direct democracy, which Yarvin says, and he's absolutely right about, correct premise, wrong conclusion, power within an organization will always get delegated to individuals within that group, elected or otherwise. The reason this is so vital is because even in a union, so you think of there's the bosses, and what the workers can do is unionize against the bosses or for more power. Well, not everyone goes to the union meeting, and not everyone talks, and some people make better points than others, and the whatever rules you decide on were not in the heads of everyone at the beginning. Some people are better persuaders than others, and they got their rules into the union, whatever, the committee decision-making process. So some people are, so even in that, that sort of mechanism of association, you still have an oligarchy. This is what he's right about. This is what's so important. This is what ANCOMs and leftists get wrong all the time. So they assume democracy is inherently good. And that's why that's why there's so much alignment with us and them. Thoughts on any of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean I think that's right. Is that you like in any type of structure, organizational structure, you're going to have an amount of people that are more dedicated, more committed, that just care more than other people, and that's going to be reflected in the work, and that's going to be reflected in the outcome of their work, and they're going to be more rewarded in that system as opposed to the people who don't care as much or don't put in as much effort. Right? This overlaps quite well with the Pareto principle.
And it's good. It allows for the division of labor and specialization.
Absolutely.
So there's nothing terrible about this. There was, oh God, I wish I could find this quote. I keep forgetting to look. I remember when I was really into basketball, it was something like a very small percentage of kids who play basketball get to go to college. An even smaller portion get to the NBA. And that's where it is. No. Even within the NBA, there's an oligarchy where 1% of the players sell 99% of the jerseys. It's like Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and the fourth guy is like way down on the list as far as sales go. So the fact that we see this everywhere in human structures is why hierarchy is legitimate, but monarchy is not. So again, I'm saying this because they will often say, well, hierarchy exists and monarchy is legitimate as a result. They're talking about two totally different
It's the difference between like a de jure monarchy instituted through law and a de jure hierarchy instituted through law, and a de facto hierarchy instituted through just interaction.
Here is a excerpt from Why I'm Not a Libertarian by Curtis Yarvin. I think this is the most underlying point that he makes against the ideology. Would you mind reading this, please?
Oh, absolutely. So this is from his post, Why I'm Not a Libertarian. And he goes on to say, in my opinion, the practical problem with grounding libertarianism in the ideals of the American Revolution is that Americans no longer hold those ideals, and Europeans never did. Both today follow a moral code which is essentially socialist. It is true that this is the natural consequence of education at the hands of the government, which is essentially socialist. It is also irrelevant. The consequence is the reality. You cannot explain to people that they ought to believe in, say, freedom of contract as a fundamental human right, when in fact they do not. As Hume again pointed out, ethical axioms are not debatable. End quote.
So when it comes to this, he's saying that, look, people believe in socialism generally. Some didn't in the American Revolution, whatever. It is what it is now. Well, then why do you get to convince people monarchy
Yes.
is better than democracy,
Right.
which they claim to believe in?
Yeah.
But so the consequence is the reality. So stop advocating for stuff. This is the consequence.
Right.
Stop trying to write in Substack. People's minds are made up. You're trying to convince me that people can't be convinced.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. So this I think out of everything, I have this and a couple other things we'll get to later, I have the most problem with this sentence right here. You cannot explain to people that they ought to believe in, say, freedom of contract as a fundamental human right when they in fact don't. The only time it's appropriate to explain something to someone else is when they don't already believe in it.
Yarvin's explaining. Yeah.
That's the only time it is legitimate to explain something to someone else is if they don't already understand it. Okay, so if we followed that to its logical conclusion, as you pointed out, Keith, it would be like, okay, we're never going to argue for anyone to ever change their mind, because the consequence is the reality. Their current beliefs are the reality, so you can't change their mind. Which also that's just an empirical claim, which I think is just incorrect on. If we really could not change people's minds, and it's not displayed here, but earlier in Why I'm Not a Libertarian, Yarvin talks about like how social progress is essentially a lie, and he's critiquing progressivism, which I agree. The progressive view of progress is a lie mostly, but he critiques this idea of social progress, which is he believes just is not true. So society does not progress. There's nothing new under the sun. Okay, and it's reflected here in this statement. If he really believed that people just didn't change, it's pointless to try to change people's minds because their minds just don't change. Well, we would still be living in caves. We would still have chattel slavery. There's all these things throughout time which we can observe that don't exist anymore, blights on people that just don't exist anymore because people's morality shifted. Their moral views changed over time. So the idea that you can't explain to people what they ought to do is just, that's just insane to me, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and it's not like he says it can't happen on a large scale. Well, yeah, because things have happened on a large scale. All the ANCAPs I know today, none of them say, I'm an ANCAP because my daddy was and his daddy before him, and all the way back to our ancestors in Scotland in 1400. Yeah. No one said, they say, you know what? I really liked Mitt Romney, and Ron Paul said so many weird things that I had to look into it. And then I found Rothbard and then Michael Huemer and then Tom Woods, and I've been an ANCAP ever since.
No one ideologically starts as a libertarian. Almost no one, right? So
at this point,
at this point, yeah. So for Yarvin, do libertarians just spawn out of the ether? Like I'm curious, like if he was right, and just going to your point, libertarianism would just not exist, right? If you look at the course of human history, libertarianism should not exist if what he said was true.
Yes. And he says, as Hume again pointed out, ethical axioms are not debatable. Okay, then no one has the right to initiate violence against any peaceful person or fraud, and you can't debate that because it's an ethical axiom. Well, of course it's debatable. That's usual. What do you think philosophy departments do besides spread evil and socialism? They sometimes debate ethical axioms.
Right. So Hume is coming at this from Hume's guillotine, or the is-ought gap, is I think what he's referencing here. And you have to remember, Hume is coming at this from a skeptic or an empiricist perspective, right? A kind of a skeptical perspective, where he's trying to say that, look, you can't ground something, you can't get an ought from an is. You can't say that, you can't look at like a human being and therefore say that person's a human being, therefore. Now, I think the problem with Hume's thing is that he starts from an assumption that there's no good reason to believe anything. You should not necessarily believe something unless you have a good reason to. And that's kind of like the skeptic position, right? The problem with that position, just real quick before we move on, is that that applies to the axiom of skepticism itself. That applies to the fact that, okay, if you don't have a really good reason for believing, if you shouldn't believe something unless you have a good reason for it, you don't have a good reason for believing that axiom either. So I think a much more grounded starting point for moral reasoning is moral intuition, right? And people seem to have a moral intuition that murder is wrong. And this seems to apply, there's some edge cases like psychopaths, sociopaths. But in general, most people do have this moral intuition that murder is wrong. And I think that if you start from the position that unless I have evidence to the contrary, my intuition is something I have to go off of, I think that's how you ground moral reasoning. So
again, and this has to be falsifiable. So by the case of people having different moral views in their earlier years and later years, regardless of what they are, the fact that they change a lot can refute this. You have approval ratings of politicians, which I guess wouldn't be ethical axioms, but the idea that you can't explain to people that they ought to believe in. A lot of people change their opinions, whether it's rational or irrational.
yes.
That still can be refuted by the fact that it's changed.
Yes.
And again, I can tell you, there are a lot of that is true. That when people are much younger, they believe in concepts of progressivism. As they get older, they believe in the much more constrained worldview. Jamie White's explanation is everyone, when I was younger was a liberal and now they're all conservative. And I think what happened is, we saw that the people that we knew who were scumbags got government positions and we just stopped seeing them as like a totally legitimate authority. That is a large scale explanation or a large scale example of people changing. If you ask them in college versus when they're out of college versus when they're in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, people can change. So that I thought was his best point. And also there's a concept called revealed choice preference. So there's this idea, I really want to see grandma and hang out with her, but I just can't. What do you mean you can't? You have an access to a car, you know where she lives, you don't really want to see her. It's been a year. You have time. You watch shows. You could have done it. So that's how we really know where people stand. So because of something like revealed choice preference, looking at people's actions, your preferences are revealed by your actions. Are there any people who engage in freedom of contract and then later disassociate with people and then feel like they have the freedom to do so? Well, their actions certainly tell us they do. And yes, if you ask them, they'll say that they do. It's the equivalent of saying you can't explain to people that living in a house or using language is beneficial if they don't believe that. Maybe they don't. I doubt it. But they do. That's what their actions show us. So therefore, it's believable that that they're engaged in believing in freedom of contract since they do it so often. His final response to this could be, well, yeah, technically they do it, but they don't consistently believe in freedom of contract like GANCAPs do. So if you push them, they won't have good arguments. And that's why they don't really believe in it. Well, you know what else they don't believe in? Monarchy and statism, because they don't have any good arguments for those, just like Luddites and protectionists don't have any good arguments for their worldview.
Most people don't have consistent beliefs for anything. So that they follow to the logical conclusion. So yeah, it's not a knockdown argument at all. Just as you said, right? Like Yarvin's trying to say that we shouldn't try to persuade anyone because trying to change people's minds when they don't already agree with you, which is defeats the purpose itself, but whatever. He says that's just pointless. It's like, well, you're a monarchist, dude. you're writing to people, trying to persuade other people of your ideas.
All right. This is where it gets a little sad. This one, this is one of his Substacks that sort of went viral because the Mencius Moldbug account, which is not run by Yarvin, this guy had said, I'm so sick. I shouldn't get into that. That's why this is popular. That account tweeted this out. Here is, would you mind reading this?
Of course. Title
and then one paragraph at a time?
Sure. So this is, I think it's pretty recent, isn't it? I don't know when he wrote this, but it's pretty recent. How to Gently Suppress Any Airborne Virus. That's the title. And he goes on to say, clearly, we are utter fools if we cannot learn from the success of the Chinese regime. despite its clear complicity in covering up the leak in the first place, in suppressing the novel coronavirus. Actually, suppressing a respiratory virus is a crucial test of the state capacity, and it is no surprise the world's most economically successful regime would prove its most epidemiologically successful. That's a statement.
So many of the people who, like Yarvin, will say, look, if we do nothing, we can sit back and be cool, principled, voluntarists. But if we do nothing, we'll be like Australia. So sadly, we have to do DeSantis so we don't end up like Australia. Well, China is worse than Australia. In this case, they were bad from the beginning. As far as covering it up, yeah, that's one way to put creating the lab and creating the virus in the Wuhan lab of virology. And not to take away credit where credit's due, Fauci and the NIH gave EcoHealth Alliance the money for the gain of research function. I never want to deprive that kind of man of credit. Actually, suppress is a crucial test. Yeah, it is a test. So he must really like the country of Nigeria, since Nigeria has very low rates. Maybe it's because they take things like ivermectin and other antiviral, anti-malarial medication. We also have places like Cambodia where the numbers are very low. Also, I don't believe the Chinese numbers. They have every incentive to diminish them. In America, they have every incentive to inflate them because of the press, and you get more money and hospitals get more money if they are dealing with these patients. So they have every incentive to call comorbidity deaths COVID deaths. So again, I mean, he put so many eggs in this basket of, look, a good thing happened. This is why we need it. As far as it being most economically successful, it's been a monarchy for a long time, but only once it embraced more free markets and more private property in 1979, as Ronald Coase showed in his economic research. That's what's making it more of a powerhouse than it otherwise is, or else North Korea would be the economic powerhouse and South Korea would be the blank slate at night. Thoughts on this first paragraph?
Yeah, it's really depressing. I would also like to. I would want to know what exactly Yarvin means by most economically successful regime, because first off, I'm not going to deny that obviously China, from where it was when it was communist or fully communist, it is certainly improved by leaps and bounds, and it's certainly economically successful. But I would just want to know Yarvin's methodology for determining what economically successful is. But that's a little aside. His idea of that China has done a great job at suppressing the virus, it's like you can't determine necessarily that we have a good reason to assume they're lying. From this, that doesn't prove they're lying, but it's a good assumption, it's a good intuition. I would then go on to just wonder why he thinks necessarily that, because even if we assume the numbers are accurate, that it's necessarily because of the Chinese government's lockdowns that corresponds directly or caused the numbers associated with the numbers that are presented. I think this, without further evidence or without more evidence to support his claim, I think this is falling into a correlation causation fallacy again.
Yeah, for a guy who likes to go on very long about things, which of course we generally appreciate.
Yes.
The fact that he doesn't give like a sentence to what he means by most economically successful and most epidemiologically successful. Yeah. Look, you create the virus that's not epidemiologically successful. Not cool. That's like a 0 out of 10 on the epidemiological success scale. Also, so the current number, according to World Health Organization, is like 5.3 million.
Yeah.
That is like 1/4 of what the Japanese killed in China in the Second World War alone during their monarchy emperor, Hirohito, with Hideki Tojo calling a lot of the shots. So you don't get to say, oh, there's a virus and that's killed people and therefore we need a monarchy. Well, let's look at what else monarchies do and what emperors do when they have a lot of power. That's one regime in China from when was Manchuria invasion? 1931. So in a 14-year span, that's 1/4 of what that one government killed, let alone all the monarchies throughout history. So enough of this looking to someone. And look, all the Asian countries have lower numbers because
Right.
that's where SARS-CoV-1 came from. They have a higher immune system. You'd have to
Right.
compare it to Chinese people in America who weigh the same as the Chinese people in China.
Yes.
Because look, I'm the first to say I'm not. I am the typical not in good shape American. But so if I got it, which I did in December of last year, versus someone in China getting it, I'm much more likely to die from it if everything we know about, people being overweight and exercising less, being more likely to die from this. So this is just weak.
Yeah, there's he makes a claim and then he makes another claim, but there's no like link to it. I don't see like there's so many other, as you're saying, there could just be, and it's very likely they could have just more natural immunity if you even believe the numbers in the first place. So there's so many other variables that he doesn't present here that are considered or should be considered to make the claim stronger.
And would you mind reading the next two?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So he goes on to say in this next paragraph, it is unfortunate that China's success with lockdown, in quotes, policies has spawned a range of generally ineffective, watered-down Western, quote-unquote, lockdown theater. It is not clear that any Western, quote-unquote, non-pharmaceutical invention has had any significant effect on the shape of Western COVID waves. In any case, the waves and the variants keep coming. Chinese COVID strategy works in China, but for the West, inventing a strategy from scratch will probably work better than copying China. Here are some simple options in case anyone cares, and then that'll be the next part. But yeah, that.
Okay. For someone so smart, for him to say blank works, that is up there with studies show.
Yes.
That's how I know I'm speaking to someone who is not really caring to make a valid point. What do you mean works? Compared to what? At what cost?
Right.
What's your definitive evidence? So, yeah, I guess if no one was ever able to leave their house, it would work.
Yeah, I mean,
it would help things.
China was welding people in their apartment buildings at the start of this.
I know.
Maybe if we did that, maybe that might work. In fact, what if we just hear me out. What if we just locked every person in America in prison? They would have food. They would have, all this great stuff. Wouldn't that be great? We could probably eliminate COVID.
I think that would work.
Yeah.
And now that I've called it work good, assumes effort in a direction. So it's good. I've made did you know that genocide works? Did you know that slavery works? Did you know that kidnapping works? Did you know that it works? And obviously the policies in the West also work almost perfectly, considering the idea is work means allow for the politicians and their collaborators to coercively rule over the rest of us and gain us under mind control. It works very well.
I was just going to say that,
good job.
He acts
it works.
He acts like the U.S.'s intention is to we just want to end the virus. It's like, okay, from their incentive, from just their incentive structure, just imagine how much power they have amassed from this virus. Now, whether you think the virus is legitimate or not, I think it's real. But the fact that it doesn't matter. The fact is that this is the ratchet effect, where it's like the state incorporates more power, and then they have no incentive to get rid of that power. So things are going very well for the state, and it's going very well for their cronies in big business who are profiting immensely from this. So he has an implicit belief here, it seems, that the Western lockdowns have not worked. No, I on the contrary, I think they've worked just how the policymakers intended them to work.
Exactly. Yeah, and as far as lockdown theater, he's admitting that governments have no problem pretending to want to do something that inconveniences millions of people, especially the kids. Oh God, I tweeted something out. John Ziegler had a talk with his daughter on his show, and she is just the way she talks about how she hates. I think she's like 9. How she hates the masks at school and how ridiculous it. God, that's so sad and so unacceptable that if they're willing to do it for that, I mean, heavens, what are these people not capable of? So you don't get to say. It's a crucial test to see if we could help people live, because people living is good. By the way, it doesn't really matter that monarchs and big governments have killed people all throughout history. You have to choose one. Either you're the humanitarian or the brutalist when it comes to monarchy justification. And you have to mention the people the CCP killed in order to get their grasp on power, both in the war against Chiang Kai-shek in the Second World War with the Japanese and Mao's Great Leap Forward. You don't just get to have the pros on your side. You also have to look at the cons. So these were just things that I had already mentioned earlier. Robert F. Kennedy, who's done excellent work on this, has said that he thinks approving chloroquine, which is their version of HQ, let's just call it, it is why the China numbers are much lower than they otherwise would have been. Where was all right? It gets worse, baby.
Oh yes.
So here is the next paragraph. It's titled "Seal International Borders." The word "seal," it's such a childish cover-up of what's actually happening. Like you're just sealing the Ziploc bag on a sandwich.
Right.
Like it's just like no persons are getting hurt. It's just sort of sealing, like closing the door real tight during the windstorm. It literally means anyone who moves out of this geographical area, we blow their frickin' head off in front of their family. And by the way, I care about people so much. That's why a crucial test for a state is seeing if they can pass a respiratory virus. I mean, you can't you can't play these. Look, I care about people living. By the way, I don't care how many millions of people die. We have to seal international borders, stop millions of people from achieving their ends voluntarily. He gets so obsessed with the end that he forgets the means.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Or I'm sorry, he forgets what his ends, the original motivation he had for those ends in the first place. If it's human well-being, it's just like the neocons.
Yeah.
9/11 was such an evil tragedy. We must avenge it, and I don't care how many children we have to kill to achieve that. Okay, you're now worse than Bin Laden. You should have treated it as a criminal act like anything else. Yarvin says, if the 2020s have taught us one thing, one thing.
So
all right.
Painful.
So this is
so
one
painful.
thing. This is the one thing that he's learned. Everything else is up in the air. There's one thing that he's learned. It is that humanity can live without travel.
Oh.
Yeah, humanity can live with rape, with slavery. It can live with stabbings. I'm not sure what this is proving. You can live. So what if you can necessarily do something? It doesn't mean you should. And
also,
Biden shows us that we could live under democracy. So we can live. Therefore, democracy is okay. What is this psychopathy?
On a law, like you can say, well, humans can live theoretically without travel in, every once in a while. But if you really broaden your time horizon, that's not a true statement. If humans had never traveled, they would have just died. Over a certain amount of time. And go ahead and continue. I don't want to interrupt though before you're done reading.
No, sadly, we have to take this one sentence at a time. I mean, that's how bad this is. Humanity can live without travel. I don't even know if that's true today. What would that have to? That would have to entail planes being sent that are remote controlled planes, because you can't have pilots.
Right.
Because pilots are human beings traveling, and that's not necessary. So all nations would have to be independent. I guess humanity, like the human race, wouldn't go extinct, but a lot of people would die. There'd be a lot of shortages, Zimbabwe style or Weimar Germany styles. But again, the fact that they can live, people can live without marriage. Therefore, marriage should be outlawed. People can live without friends. Therefore, friendship should be outlawed.
Right.
All absolute evil nonsense. Yeah. This is just like a difference between, we all have the same ends, we just have different means. This is literally, some people own the bodies of others. I don't care how much misery it costs.
Yeah.
Isn't one of the great things of life seeing the beautiful cathedral? Maybe I'm just thinking of cathedrals because we're talking about him, but the beautiful cathedrals of Europe and traveling, on road trips with friends and,
there's more to life than just existing. If you're just existing, you like in a technical sense you're living, but you're not really like fulfilling any type of human end that you could fulfill as a human being.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can live in the concentration camps of Australia, as you see in the bottom right-hand
Yeah.
corner, as reported by the New York Times, not just something on Twitter. Because even when I see something on Twitter, I'm like, am I really seeing that, or am I just seeing what I think, what sort of fits my worldview?
Right.
This is a legit thing. Coercive
Yeah.
quarantine centers, of course they're called. In particular, Yarvin continues, in particular, it is simply an urban legend that trade requires travel, a
Oh
piece
my
of governance theater that harks us back to the day of the real-life traveling salesman. I guess people have to be on the ships. I mean, can people go between states, Your Highness? Is that okay with you?
The idea
I
that
need a license? Do I need a license? That's worse. That is just as bad as the Swedish microchips they're planting in people. That's mainstream news, by the way. That's not
Yeah.
David Icke nonsense. That's worse. That's way worse than vaccine passports. Because what do you even need the passport for? Just don't get it. You don't need to travel anyways. Trade doesn't require travel. You can still live.
unless he is literally talking about drones flying into places and giving people like dropping off supplies, trade literally requires travel. So I have no idea what he means when he says this. Like that statement, it's an urban legend that trade requires travel. I'm perplexed. I'm legitimately blown away by this statement because I cannot think, unless he's talking about like a completely like artificial drone based like delivery system. That's just untrue. Like if we're talking about the real world, if we're talking about like the consequences are the reality, as Yarvin said before, if we're talking about the real world right now, trade requires travel. If all the truckers stop driving to deliver trade and food to grocery stores, people will die. Okay, like people are going to die.
Humanity can live.
That's right. Humanity can live.
If
right,
there's
right.
one person left after all the devastation, he's
That's
right.
Yeah,
We have to take back everything. It hurts us. Trade requires. It's an urban legend. All right. Have we beat this dead horse? Well,
Yeah.
just look at Australia is betting on remote quarantine. Here's what I learned inside. That's the New York Times article. This is this piece on Substack, by the way, is titled Omicron and Governance Theater. So, yeah, I guess the thing that just boils me about this is that you're assuming goodness on the half of the state where they have this thing called terrorism that they're against. So once they solve it, then they'll give us our freedoms back. There's this thing called illness, and they just need to take away some freedoms because they're doing the best they can, and they'll give it back to us right when they're done. It's this. I guess you could call it childish, as he called us earlier. This idea that one single person who is fallible, I'm going to violently stop billions of people from achieving their ends based on a China model that I think is successful, even though I don't use the numbers comparatively to other Asians in America and other Asian countries. So based on pretty much nothing, he's willing to usher in like the closest thing to totalitarianism that one could probably achieve. Flatten high waves with short lockdowns is the next paragraph. So every time there's a technical wave, the state gets to murder everyone who exits their house. Yarvin says, quote, in a true lockdown, not a lockdown theater, no one leaves their house. Supplies are delivered.
Oh.
Who is doing the delivering of this supplies that no one's able to leave their house for?
Right.
And who's doing this trade if people aren't able to travel?
I'm just perplexed. I don't understand how to read this in any coherent way.
No one leaves their house. And the sad thing is this is not descriptive. This is
right. And
it's saying we need like a China model. The U.S. was good in the Gilded Age. It's like China today. Here's what China did. Here's what we need to learn from them. Here's what we need to do. He's literally saying this. That's why it's so devastating.
And this is right after he was saying it's a waste of time to try to, prescribe ideas to people when they don't already believe those ideas. And yet he's trying to advocate for something that people luckily don't believe in America right now. At least, it's not. At least it's not this bad yet. But he's trying to prescribe something even worse, and I hope they're not listening to him. So
99.99%, and that's what it takes.
Yeah,
that's the survival rate it takes
Yeah.
for people to entertain nonsense
Yeah.
like this. It's just so evil. Since the government knows who you are and where you live, it knows what you need.
Okay, can we
That's
just?
a literal.
Can
I just read that sentence. I had to take a screenshot because I
Yeah.
go, I only took screenshots here because I go, if I copy and paste this, I'm going to get accused of fraud, and
Yes.
I wouldn't blame a single person for thinking that I've been the host this long just to
this
perpetrate a
statement
fraud.
might be the most insulting that I've read. I'm not joking. So, for someone who claims to be a follower of Mises, someone who believes that the Austrians are brilliant, that Mises was brilliant, the statement that since the government knows who you are and where you live, it knows what you need, is insane. Like, I'm sorry, I can't take this serious. I can't take Yarvin seriously right now. Like, it's just such a non-statement, knowing what I know he knows, that it has to be like an elaborate troll, or else he's just incoherent here. Like, it's so hard for me to honestly take that seriously. If you think that break down what makes you think the government knows what you need. How could they ever know what you need at any given time? What if you change your mind on what you need? What if your hierarchy of values changes from moment to moment when they're already trying to supply you something? There's all these different effects. Without the price system, how do they know how to accurately allocate resources? It's all these elementary questions that the Austrian school has been dealing with for so long, and they're right about. And Yarvin, who claims to be at least a fan of the Austrian school, could make this audacious claim here is perplexing to me.
Yeah. So my good friend at the Institute, Patrick McFarlane, he knows who I am and he knows where I live. Does he know what I need? How does government? Knowing A and B does not mean I'll know C when C equals need. Also, well, maybe C just means a rice cake and water. At the very least, if you're just talking about survival, and since you don't need to travel, if the 2020's taught us anything, then I guess he might literally be saying that. But just because we need it, we also need courts and we also need police. But government's terrible at providing those. So we'd want competitively competing, voluntarily funded organizations to achieve those things. So just even if I sent them a list of what I need, I have no incentive to economize if there's no price mechanism and I can't go to my job and I can't trade and I can't compare to alternatives at the store. And why would they go through the work of pleasing me? No matter what, I serve them. Oh, yay, a new sentence. If you have this quote, if you have a car, you may even if you have a car, I love how he's admitting that there's going to be so many shortages under this. If you have a car, I don't know. It looked like Henry Ford made the Model T available en masse like decades and decades ago. And he goes, well, if you have a car in the 2020s, he knows there's going to be so many shortages when the government's calling this many shots. You may even be drafted into doing deliveries. Okay, so no one leaves their house and people are doing deliveries.
Yes.
No one travels and people are traveling. I'm sure he's one of the smartest people on the planet and he hasn't put a lot of thought into this, or he has, and he is not the good person that I thought I admired. Either way, he is unfit to exist. And he would be probably a better... Or no, he's unfit to be a monarch, rather.
I
didn't mean that at all. But I was trying to channel the Spooner quote of the Constitution that no matter what, it's unfit to exist. He is unfit to rule, and he'd be a better monarch probably than most people. Until I read this, it's just so bad. I might be enslaved. That's my system. Potential slavery. But they'll never abuse that power. We're going to give them tons of power, and they're not going to abuse it. And what if they do abuse it? Well, then you'll just say, well, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We just need a different type of government. In a true lockdown, you test yourself every day. Fuck you. I'll test myself fuck I want. Then show a photo of the test to your pandemic app. I'm glad that won't get corrupted. If you test positive, you are taken to a pandemic hotel.
It
I'm sure
sounds
it'll
so
be like,
nice, doesn't it, Keith? A pandemic hotel.
it'll be like the Four Seasons.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, where you get antivirals. How do you know that they'll give us that? How do you know they won't mistreat us? That kidnappers at the employ of the state won't mistreat us. By the way, have I left my house? Because I'm not allowed to leave my house to go to the hotel. Who's taking me? People who are not allowed to leave their house.
Yeah, he's
And
living
also,
in Yarvin stand in his head. So
and also in America, the government was totally against antivirals. They had basically said nothing until the vaccine, antibodies, and chicken soup. Yeah, there's not going to be a shortage of chicken or soup or travel. The government in America, and it could happen under a monarchy as well, they were very against the use of alternative methods to the point where anyone who so much as talks about them gets called a crazy horse dewormer conspiracy theorist. It wasn't until Joe Rogan said, I took ivermectin and I took monoclonal antibodies. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I don't know what it is. To Sanjay Gupta. And then Sanjay Gupta went on Don Lemon's show. And Don Lemon, of course, gave him the Jeff Zucker ringer of, we need to bring this guy back in because he didn't serve us well enough. And Sanjay Gupta says, well, Rogan said that he took ivermectin and he took these antibodies. And I think it was the antibody treatment that really helped him recover so quick. Right there, we have an admission from the CNN doctor. HNIC of the CNN doctor Sanjay Gupta said he thought that there was something that made people better, and he isn't out there recommending it to every single person, saying this is what works, this is what, in my medical opinion, is going to help people recover faster. That is how you know there is no innocent explanation behind the, well, they just forgot to mention potential antiviral treatments.
Yeah.
No, that's how they got the emergency authorization for Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson. There is no need to prevent contagion within the hotel. The staff wear high-performance respirators. Okay, so once there's this big monarchy ushering in tyranny, he knows that they're going to have high performance, that they'll be performing very high-quality service. They're going to have every incentive. They're going to make Yarvin's going to be calling the shots when someone else is a monarch who never answers to him.
Right.
2 weeks of true lockdown is a long time. It will end with certain pods which have to stay home.
What an appropriate term.
Because they were exposed. Again, 99.99%.
Yeah.
Once every home is past the incubation period, any kind of massive sustained infection will be gone. What's left will be the residue of accident and non-compliance. All right, I think. Anything else on that?
I think I've said what I've said on this part.
Too much faith in people who have no incentive to provide a good service. I don't know how else beside it being evil. My whole thing, what I got from this, and maybe this was me just being emotional, was there's just no worry of imposition. Not just on one person or two, or every system, people are inconvenienced. He just has no problem putting millions of obligations on billions of people, and no matter what, his position's unfalsifiable. Hey, bad government, government's a neutral tool. Got to try something different. I don't care how many millions of people I kill.
And it's also very weird, going back from the other slide when he's talking about like why I'm not a libertarian, because he's trying to say that prescription is somehow useless. It's not helpful to prescribe certain outcomes to people because the consequence of the reality currently is the reality, right? And now he's trying to prescribe a solution to lockdowns, which is much more tyrannical than what's going on right now. And he somehow, did he go back on what he said before? Does he now think that, now it's actually useful to prescribe certain things to people? It's just kind of contradictory.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the disarming your enemy. It's really bad to have guns, says the U.S. government. do they have any guns at government, or do they just
Right.
persuade people? Well, when someone starts shooting at other people, they just send them a strongly worded letter from Jen Psaki. No, of course not. They know that the guns are important. So he knows that ideas change things, which is why that's so sad. If I look at a book he came on my show to talk about, this is a chapter in Democracy, the God That Failed, on the errors of classical liberalism and the future of liberty. So it seems like he has this like moral nihilism. So something is inevitable, therefore we should submit to it. I believe that ideology can win, and I believe this is where the left's power lies. When they talk about racism, colonialism, sexism, homophobia, whatever else, they don't say, I have studies and the majority of the studies tend to show that it doesn't work. They'll say that sometimes about very few things. Their biggest points where they get the most amount of power is racism, inherently bad, unacceptable. Sexism, inherently bad, unacceptable. We cannot have this. Colonialism is pure evil, and all this stuff. So what Hans Hoppe says is that we have the moral high ground, actually. And that's how we can have a stable foundation of promoting our ideas. He says, would you mind reading this?
The highlighted part?
The whole thing. I'm sorry to do that to you.
Oh,
but
no. I was just no, it's fine. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He says, this is Hoppe. If it is admitted that taxation and monopoly are just, then the liberal has no principal moral case to make. To lower taxes is not a moral imperative. Rather, the liberal case is exclusively an economic one. For instance, lower taxes will produce certain long-term economic benefits. However, at least in the short run, and for some people, the current tax recipients and lower taxes also imply economic costs. Without moral argument at his disposal, a liberal is left only with the tool of cost-benefit analysis, but any such analysis must involve an interpersonal comparison of utility. And as such, a comparison is impossible, scientifically impermissible. Hence, the outcome of the cost-benefit analysis is arbitrary, and every proposal justified with reference to them is mere opinion. In this situation, democratic socialists only appear more upfront, consistent, and consequent, while liberals come across as starry-eyed, confused, and unprincipled, or even opportunistic. They accept the basic premise of the current order of the democratic government, but then they constantly lament its anti-liberal outcome. If liberalism is to have any future, it must repair its fundamental error. Liberals will have to recognize that no government can be contractually justified, that every government is destructive of what they want.
Yeah. When I look at the power of someone like AOC, one of the most powerful people on the planet, Jimmy Dore's made a good case for. She's one of the most well-liked by or definitely well liked by the media. I think her numbers are much further down than it seems. She basically gets all of this power, and as does Bernie, one through historical narratives and giving people the ideas of what happens. The New Deal was good. We need a Green New Deal. So fake historical narratives give her a lot of power. So as Hoppe says, in Libertarian Quest for Historical Narrative, we need to embrace narratives and stories as well to really grab at people's heartstrings so their mind is able to work harmoniously with their feelings. But what she says, healthcare is a right, education is a right. Other people are doing it. That's as far as I'll go with making my empirical case. Other people do it, well, because as I also told the kids I used to babysit for, if other people told you to jump off a bridge, would it be okay? That's not where the real power lies. It is education is a right. Healthcare is a right. Of course, it involves enslaving others if it's a positive right. But if we take this case and compare it to theirs, look, there's just no uninventing this concept. Jeffrey Tucker says ideas are like viruses. Yeah. And once this lie of political authority is exposed, it's hopefully not going back. It's not inevitable, but this can win, just as the leftist wins with, to talk about can people change. There's the levels of racism, sexism, and homophobia have changed. But
Yes.
whatever you think they are not the same. Therefore,
That's
people
right.
can change both at an individual level
Yes.
and societies.
Yes.
So, yes, we are not dumb idiots bumping into walls because we care about ideology. We're looking at who's winning and what they're doing.
Yarvin in Why I'm Not a Libertarian, he specifically rejects like any moral norm, right? He's thinking about things just through like an engineering perspective about like what is, right, and what can be. So he rejects the moral basis for libertarianism, and that's one of the reasons I think he's not a libertarian. But I wanted to address the inevitability issue, right? So here's the thing: most people still hold moral norms against things that are generally considered inevitable, right? So let's imagine a scenario where most people around the world are against murder. Most people would also would say that murder can never be eradicated from the human species, right? There's always going to be murderers somewhere, some time. So the fact that we can't get rid of murder doesn't entail that we should submit to the murderers or that we should let ourselves be ruled by murderers or be killed. Same for rapists and thieves, right? So this is, in my opinion, why, like, if you're an anarchist, even if you believe that the state would not go away, now I'm not making that claim, but that even if we assume that the state would always be there, that doesn't mean we should still submit to it, right? If a time traveler came to me and said 10,000 years into the future there are still states, I would still be an anarchist because I still believe that it is morally unjustified for the state to rule in the way it does. Now, your point to ideology is great, because this is, as you said, this is where the left wins. They have better rhetoric. They can use their rhetoric in a way that appeals to moral intuitions that people have. And now the left, of course, defiles these intuitions into like state aggression. But there's like a moral intuition or a premise that people have that, yeah, people should, have money. They shouldn't starve to death on the street. There's people shouldn't treat others as less than them. There's a certain something that they're pulling from there. And they're able to, rhetorically drive that into different policies, into different policy proposals that gain steam over time. So people do change their minds. And in fact, the greatest example of this would be the abolition of slavery. At one time, everyone thought it was completely legitimate to own another person, like explicitly, right? And now, if you thought about that legitimately today, people would like run you out of town, right? So Yarvin's empirical claim about like earlier on that people just don't change their mind or it's pointless to try to change their mind, I just think that's false. You ignore like every single possible outcome that has come from people having their minds changed, even whether they've been like deceived in some sense, right? That's still a changing of someone's mind, even if they've been deceived by something.
Yeah, you don't say, you can't logically say people don't change their minds and then just ignore the people who have changed their minds.
Yes.
Because that's like saying, everyone's Muslim except for people who think they're not Muslim.
Yeah.
They're just so dumb. And that's how deep into Islam they
You're
are.
affirming
that they can't even see the Islam that they believe in.
Yes.
That's how, right. So when it's unfalsifiable like that again, well, then of course he can always be right. So when I think of comparative questions, I say, all right, so he rejects the morality of the situation, which I think we just need to start taking people at their word for and just start demanding of them that, so you don't have a preference, whether I stab you or you choose to get surgery by a doctor. Because in both cases, you're getting cut and you're bleeding and there's sometimes pain. There's no difference between those. So I think it's important to really push it in someone's face. So me shooting into a crowd and killing a random person is just as bad as a woman murdering a guy, raping her. Because in both cases, people get shot. There's no like, who cares if one person's aggressing and the other person's not aggressing? It's the same thing. Right. That is how dumb you have to be to say that, well, the nap is just ridiculous. So that's just my final thing on the moral nihilist thing. When it comes to, all right, he's an engineer, he just cares about efficiency. The questions that I would have that I still think the free marketeers win is because every shortcoming of the free market applies tenfold to the state because they don't face competition and you can't opt out of funding them. So I would ask him, which system incentivizes innovation? Well, the king has a low time preference. Everyone can have a low time preference at some point in their own life. The king Whoever is the king in that society would be of the same species as other people in a free market.
Yes.
Some would have low time preference, others high, and that's how we trade. And that's why trade is meaningful.
Yes.
Any thoughts on this first comparative question and anything else you have on the moral status of rejecting self-ownership, voluntary exchanges?
Well, on the comparative advantage here, I think it's absolutely what you said is absolutely true, right? So, like, I want to be very clear: the anarchists and the libertarians are not saying that the free market is only going to ever produce good results, or there's ever only going to be good things in a free market society. It's the fact that every single problem of the free market is just a problem with existence itself, and they get more, and the problems become more and more apparent and more costly to more people the more they're centralized and monopolized. So that's why if I'm just a decentralized actor and I take an action which affects me, the cost is going to be on me, and then I also get an informational signal because I suffered a loss. That's going to like direct me in a way where I can, okay, if I don't want to take losses anymore, it can kind of show me how did I go wrong? What can I improve upon? What did other people around me do where they improved, where they succeeded, where I failed? So you do have this comparative analysis from decentralized actors when they fail. So it's not that it's always going to produce good things. It's that when people fail, they gain information from it, and most importantly, the cost is generally directed towards them. They feel the cost. Whereas when you have a monopolized structure and something goes wrong, everyone pays for it, right? If the state messes up, guess what? That money is coming from your taxes, bud.
Exactly. Which system incentivizes growth? Again, you can say that the monarch might or is likely to have a low time preference. Again, maybe he's a psycho like other people who don't even value their own property.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, which system has less monarchical South Korea done better or worse as far as innovation and getting shit done, as he likes to say, than North Korea? He's got to handle that objection,
Right.
because that's the best example of two comparative populations. That's reasonable. It's not like China and America. What a dishonest comparison for COVID numbers. Second, what we said about the Watchmen. Bad actors exist always, everywhere, as humans. Which system best counteracts them? I again think it's the free market that at least you can disassociate with them and not fund them, and they don't get a magical money printing machine that attracts the most evil people ever. Second, if we have someone evil, like Bezos or Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, let's say they're all pure evil. They can't get a penny out of my pocket unless they make me happy with a product or service that I want to purchase in exchange for them.
And if they try to force you would be legally justified in resisting.
It would be widely recognized that I have a right to resist. They'd be seen as any other criminal.
That's right.
Whereas the monarch would have this halo of legitimacy.
Yes.
That's not justified at all. Where does the equilibrium lie? Again, he can say that, well, the monarch is not going to totally deplete his future income because he has a low time preference. Maybe not. Maybe. But how do you find that equilibrium? Should you consume everything now, everything later? Well, neither of those. What you want to find is a balance. A free market that allows people to innovate and come up with substitutes is a much better way to find an equilibrium, rather than will the single psycho feel like the costs are now beginning to outweigh the benefits.
Right. And
no correcting mechanism.
Right. And with an equilibrium, you in some sense have to use the market process as like a filter, like an evolutionary filter in some sense, to find out where that magic sweet spot is for anything. Because if you try to centrally plan, you have no idea where the equilibrium is, because you can't engage in analysis in regards to prices and the scarcity of resources. So when we're talking about prices in the market, what prices are ultimately they give an incentive, but ultimately prices are information, right? So whenever we're engaged in a local transaction, Keith, you and I are engaged. You want to trade me something, I want to trade you something. We have knowledge of things within our vicinity, right, that we trade with. What we don't have, not like direct local knowledge of, is like the resources that went into the things we were trading and what the scarcity is of them right now and what are the production levels, the transportation to get from A to B, like all these different things. But those things are communicated to people implicitly through the price system. Right. So you have to, if you just don't engage in the price system, you're not going to find an equilibrium whatsoever.
Yeah, I think Alex Tabarrok said it best when he said a price is a signal wrapped in an incentive.
Yes.
The higher prices will signal that some things are more scarce than others and provide an incentive for people to use the scarce resources that society has in a much more efficient way. Again, shortcomings with that, but it's still in the voluntary realm.
Right,
which
and you can never hit
equilibrium,
but you can always be oriented towards the equilibrium.
Yeah, again, which process is superior? It's not like instead of being imperfect, we should be perfect. There's always constraints. And then I just tried to summarize my general position. What Yarvinism leads out, and I didn't mean to. That was more a note to myself than calling it that. What I said, well, the concept of monarchy being superior to the free market has a shortcoming, which I see as the following. It's a worldview that does not distinguish between a boxing match and assault. It should be rejected because any attempt to design a system for human beings should recognize what distinguishes human beings as a species, namely the ability to reason and act in comparison to ideals. Some having the right to own the bodies of others, rule them, a monarch or any sort of state, rejects the human capacity to reason and diminishes the incentive for the aggressor to act in a beneficial manner, pleasing others while creating a world less desirable. Imagine all 30-year-olds have the right to monarch or rule 20-year-olds. What if Asians had the right to rule whites? You could say that there's a lot of benefits to some of these things. Asians have higher IQs than whites, and maybe a lower time preference. That doesn't justify us having this one sacred life of ours being used as simply a mere means to other people. While aggression can be beneficial for some at the expense, non-harmony of interests of others, not everyone benefits if everyone does so overall. The examples would be standing at a show allows you to see better. Everyone standing does not allow everyone to see better. If one person is given a PhD by Harvard, that person can make a lot of money. If everyone's issued a Harvard PhD at birth, then no one's going to be better off. So the assumption is that if some people can benefit from monarchy in some examples, well, then monarchy is beneficial. It does not allow for the harmony of interests, which allow some people to disassociate or say, give me a better offer, give me more money, give me something more valuable, and then I will trade with you. Yarvinism does not allow that. Monarchy doesn't. So that is my general claim. That's like my foundational opposition to this. What would you say is the main reason you are not a monarchist?
Because I don't believe other people are my property.
Love it. Yeah, he also engages in the rule versus the exception fallacy. So if I have some examples of mass murder leading to good outcomes, so mass murder should be widely practiced. What this does is not address alternative outcomes, doesn't recognize the rights of the murdered, nor does it explain how this incentivizes future behaviors of production or those aggressed against. So when you advocate something like never leaving your house or advocating a monarch with all this power, you're just not appreciating the value of human life and how complex life can be. If we're not allowed to leave our house, can we really appreciate the human condition and the world that we live in? And then finally, once the monarch is in power, you think he's going to be reading Gray Mirror, Gray with an A, the American way, as he would, as he'd like me to say. They're not going to listen to you. They have no incentive. Right. So this again is a major shortcoming. That's pretty much all I have as far as criticism go.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I would just like say I think the biggest criticism is probably his use of equivocation. That's the thing I found most like apparent to me is that how he would equivocate. I can't even speak. Equivocate power with state power, right? Which is not apparent when you just say power. It doesn't imply state power necessarily. And his equivocation of a governance structure, like of a person's property, like such as if I have a monarchical governance structure, that does not imply that if you apply a monarchical governance structure to the government, it's in any way going to be analogous to a private property governance structure.
Yeah. Yeah. So he finds the exception in monarchy and says,
Yeah.
well, this is the general rule. He then finds the exception in the free market and says, this is the general rule. Yep. Great lessons from Yarvin that
Yes.
I really appreciated. Just so people know of these. Cathedral, as we mentioned earlier, deep state, public and private, is vitally interesting. You can't just be an NPC who says state bad without recognizing their collaborators. The press-controlled state concept, vitally important. Inner and outer party. I'm not going to explain these, but people need to look into them.
Yeah, they're really good.
Oh, I loved this. By seeking expertise, universities came to rule. By politicians seeking good press, the press came to rule. That sentence is just so important.
It's great. Yeah. And I mean, it's true. Like every regime needs like some amount of popular support to exist. Every regime, even a dictatorship, requires some either acquiescence or support of the public to remain.
Of course. That's what the Cold Warriors left out when they thought, well, all we got to do is kill the leader of these communist countries and then they're gone. Nope, it's in the minds of the masses, and that's why we've worked so hard to change that public opinion. The next regime, which involves paying off potential employees loyal to the previous regime, you buy their silence. He uses the example of Wehrmacht officers in Germany still getting a pension. Yeah. That is so important to know. Just how people operate and how you can have a soft coup like that and that sort of change of power. Vitally.
It's why Hillary Clinton did not actually get locked up by Donald Trump, right? Because once you do that, then you open the door to, well, maybe they'll lock up me next, right? So you kind of have this like backdoor handshake.
Oh yeah. He also mentions to get grants, groups will exaggerate threats. So when you're getting money from the government, how do you stand out? You don't say, we don't have anything now, but give us money and we'll maybe find something. No, you got to say there's a virus going to kill people. We got to fund gain of function research. The planet's going to freeze and we need global cooling funds. We need global warming funds. We need climate change funds. And this creates an oligarchy where who do you go to find the best people in medicine? Well, you should probably go to the CEOs of Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, Johnson & Johnson. Okay, well then they make the rules, and this creates a technocracy that allows this self. God, what would you call it? I'm trying to think of the regulatory capture term that Anthony Davies uses, but by exaggerating threats, they gain power. Those involved in the industry make the rules for the industry, regulatory capture. So that's a real world logic of how something like regulatory capture can exist. Any great lessons from Yarvin that people need to appreciate?
I think these pretty much nailed it. These are the exact same I would mention too. Yeah. I would just say, if you on Twitter, you can follow me at ace_archist. I do want to plug my friend's store, neofightgear.com. My friend Greg made a store. It's if you're into like 3D printing or like 3D printing, like gun accessories, gun parts, stuff like that. Anything from that to manuals to even hot sauce. If you don't have enough money to spend on some of the more expensive stuff on the store, check out neofightgear.com. And I would just say, Keith, thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, thanks everyone for sticking with us, hopefully. Thanks for watching the Libertarian Institute and Don't Tread on Anyone. Ace, brother, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Keith.